Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
He now continues its full and complete coverage of the invasion. Here is Caesar Searchinger with his report on the news behind the news of the invasion to the moment. Mr. Searchinger.
Good afternoon. I've got a new bulletin in just now which says, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, German opposition in all quarters was less than expected. It was learned at headquarters tonight, and an optimistic tone was evident. There's another bulletin which says that American warships, particularly one battleship, moved close in to the French shore and with the help of the air forces virtually silenced the coastal guns of the landing beaches. Now that's a very interesting story, because one of the things that we always wondered about was what the coastal batteries would do to warships going in close to shore. The Germans have long told us about their terrific batteries, their terrific Atlantic wall that nothing could approach. Well, as a matter of fact, we did know that the guns which manned that Atlantic wall were largely guns taken from the French and from the Belgians. A good many of them came from the Maginot Line. And the largest guns, stationary guns on the coast there, were 11 inches, from 6 to 11 inches. Now, you can see, of course, that they do not stack up against the 11 to 16-inch guns of battleships and cruisers. And the concentration on one of our cruisers is much greater than the Germans can put on, say, several miles of coast, unless they covered the whole down coast from for 1,000 miles with guns which simply do not exist. So that the prognostications which we made some time ago about the strength of the German coastal batteries have come pretty well true. What, of course, we do not know yet is what really happened on the beaches. And many things did happen, undoubtedly. We won't go into details now. We do know that, as from the reports we have, that the Allies did crash the beaches, that they did get through the mines, that they did get through the mortars and the machine gun nests, and they must have got past a good many of the pillboxes, and they are well inland. Then, of course, we also know that our paratroopers went behind the lines and are attacking the fortifications from the other side. The big show, of course, will come further inland, may not come for some time, because it will come in the area which is the fortifications in depth which provide for a large area for maneuvering and for an army of considerable size to be brought there over the railway lines that may be left. But we do know that not much is left of the railway net behind Havre or any of the Channel coasts. And that is, of course, the real secret of our success, such as it is so far. Now, when the Allies invaded this morning, if we cast our eyes back a little bit over recent history, it is the last of a string of events that really ought to fill our hearts with pride. We go back to Pearl Harbor, 1941, December 7th. That was the beginning of it for us. For a year, nothing very much happened so far as we are concerned. But in October 23rd, 1942, there was that Battle of El Alamein that broke the line, that broke the Rommel's defense in Africa. And it was followed by this tremendous 1,000-mile retreat across North Africa. In November 8th, the Allies invaded North Africa with the greatest armada ever seen. On January 26th of 1943, the British took Tripoli, and in February 2nd, there was the victory at Stalingrad, the real turning point of the war, when the siege of Stalingrad was lifted. Well, the Battle of Europe proper, so far as we are concerned, began in July. On July 10th, the largest invasion force in history landed at Sicily. On July 25th, Mussolini fell, and on September 3rd, we invaded Italy. On September 8th, Italy surrendered, and then came that terrible Battle of Salerno, which was our first real experience in landing on a defended coast in Europe. It was a success, and Salerno proved the forerunner of what has happened this morning, the invasion of Western Europe. Well, to go a little further, on October 31, the leaders met at Moscow and planned the whole campaign, and at Tehran it was confirmed in November 26th. General Eisenhower already was in London taking charge, and since then the organization of the greatest invasion of all history has taken place. Then, of course, I should mention that 6 weeks ago the casino offensive opened, and on June 4th, 2 days ago, came the fall of Rome. Who would have thought on that day that only a day later, 2 days later, would come the great news that we've all been waiting for. You may remember that on Saturday there was some false news. By some mistake, we were told that the invasion had already started, and then it had to be denied. I happened to be on the air just after that, and I called your attention to the fact that it happened to be the anniversary of Dunkirk, of that terrific battle on the beaches of Dunkirk when the British evacuated their army of 300,000 men, which in a way was also a turning point of the war, and perhaps the day that saved civilization more than any other one day. Well, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the invasion coast. We don't know officially from the Allies where we have landed. The Germans say we have landed at Le Havre, and I've heard as many as 11 other points mentioned. Well, anywhere from Holland down to the end of Normandy is invasion coast. Calais, as you know, is the part of the coast that was most hardly hit by the invasion bombardment, the air bombardment, which went on continuously for months and months. Well, Calais is also the only place where Europe was invaded across the Channel before. In 1347, over 5 centuries ago, the British landed near Calais and fought the Battle of Crécy, and then held Calais for 200 years. Europe was not invaded again from the west until 1809, when the British landed near Flushing on the Dutch coast against Napoleon. But that invasion was decidedly not a success. The British couldn't even take Antwerp, and they had to leave again. Indeed, this is a historic day, for Europe has never been invaded in force from the west, or for that matter, from any part against a really defended coast. So this is really something that has never happened in history before. Now, as I said before, the crisis will not come immediately. The crisis will come inland. That is what the generals have warned us about for some time. It will come after the Germans have discovered the main centers of our attack and have moved into their reserves and are ready to counterattack us in force. To delay and interfere with the assembling of a counterattacking army is therefore the next problem we have to deal with. The constant bombing of railroad centers along the western coast during the past weeks and months was, in fact, the first stage of tackling that problem. This will be followed by intensive tactical bombing of the transportation system as we go along. Of course, one of the remarkable things is that we did not meet more opposition from fighters in the air. We had a tremendous cover, we can be sure of that, an umbrella of fighters the whole time. But apparently the Germans did not come up, and that seems to confirm the suspicion that the German fighter force has been very badly depleted. And, of course, that, in fact, gave us the cue as to when the invasion should take place. Then, of course, there is the employment of paratroops. That probably is taking place to an extent that has never taken place before. The Germans themselves reported that we had 80,000 of these troops in England ready for the invasion jump. This parachute corps will have the most difficult job of all. They will be expected not only to dynamite road bridges and take railroad junctions, but attack Nazi fortifications from the rear. If we have mastery in the air, and it seems that we will have from now on, the number of these troops can be increased almost at will. They'll have no heavy artillery, but the Germans themselves have shown how fortifications can be taken by sappers armed with hand grenades and dynamite. In 1940, you may remember, they took the famous Fort Emael in Belgium, and that was supposed to be impregnable with a loss of only 7 men. Now, the first real test of the invasion will come when we are perhaps 20 or more miles inland, that is, beyond the range of our naval guns. Assuming that Rommel will have had time to assemble his field army, it will be a test that we have not met before, either in Sicily or at Salerno. And, of course, the nearest test was at Salerno and at the Anzio beachhead, which now is no longer a beachhead, but part of the triumphant army that has entered Rome. Now, there doesn't seem to be anything later than I've already told you, because the Allies are keeping mum on what's happened. All that we know is what the Germans tell us. But we might tell you a little bit about what the Germans' prospects are of holding back our invasion. The Germans have made a great deal of the theory of the interior lines. They say that they have the advantage in the fortress Europe because they have the interior lines. He who operates on interior lines, of course, has an important asset. But consequently, the idea that Germany's central position in relation to her opponents will be an intrinsic advantage in the coming struggle seems to be general. Well, it's obvious that in most cases a military machine which can radiate its power from a central reservoir to the circumference, switching its principal concentration to given points at will, is in a superior position to its opponents. The latter must diffuse their resources along, so to say, a ring of reservoirs. Instead of using a radius, they can only swing their power from one point to another by following the long curve of the circumference. Allied aid to Russia goes all the way around by the Arctic or through Persia. It's a matter of elementary geometry. But this proposition is not always true and under all conditions. If a centrally situated antagonist enjoys overall superiority in weight, he can bring power to bear wherever he chooses, and so demolish his opponents piecemeal. If he is approximately equal to them in weight, interior lines are still a substantial advantage because he can effect any necessary concentration more rapidly. But what if he is inferior in numbers, in air and sea power? In that situation, the fact that he is inside a circumference, which he must maintain, is a deadly disadvantage because he is pinned down at every point on the circle, whereas his opponents are free to exploit the latest advantages of exterior lines by hitting everywhere at once if they so choose. That is the position of Germany and the Allies, respectively, today. A bulletin has just been handed to me to the effect that General William Hanstein, Commander-in-Chief of the Norwegian Underground, broadcast an order to all organized fighting groups inside Norway today to be prepared to take part in the great settlement. Hanstein told his countrymen that they would receive orders on what to do. You must not act openly except in conjunction with the Allied military plan and not before orders have been issued from here. That would seem to indicate that we might have an invasion in Norway as well as in France. It also opens the question of all the other undergrounds along the invasion coast, and particularly the French underground. What is the French underground doing? And what have the Allies done to encourage the French underground and to, beyond the instructions given by Eisenhower, to organize themselves and go to bat? Now, there's one little fly in the ointment. So far as we know as yet, there has been no agreement made with General de Gaulle about the underground, the disposition of the underground, and what is to be done about the government of France in the rear of the invasion. However, it is reported that General de Gaulle is in London now, and we hope that this problem may also be solved before long. Good afternoon.
We announce a special feature of the NBC coverage of the invasion. Tonight at 8:30 over station WNBT, NBC Television will bring you a program featuring H.V. Kaltenborn and a special Signal Corps pre-invasion film. WEAF, New York.
From our NBC newsroom in New York, we take you now to NBC in Washington.
This is Morgan Beatty speaking to you from the radio gallery of the United States Senate in Washington, where it's not exactly business as usual today, although there is a familiar routine in the air. A few moments ago, the presidential buzzer rang, denoting a list of nominations to public office, nominations that are not news on a day like D-Day. The House convened first at 11 o'clock. Instead of the usual prayer, the members themselves stood with heads bowed in silent prayer. Out in the House corridor, they carefully prepared maps of Colonel Lawrence Martin of the Library of Congress for the center of attention. Groups of representatives discussed the invasion, even as you and I. And one representative noticed the direct route to Paris ahead of our forces and said, wouldn't it be fine if they could move right into the capital of France? Speaker Rayburn stopped me on the way over to the Senate gallery to say he couldn't be with us as he had hoped. He has a luncheon date with the president today. Here in the Senate, the session opened at noon, just about a half hour ago, but most senators were in committee meetings. Not more than a handful were on the floor. And for the first time in many a moon, the Senate chaplain, Dr. Frederick Brown Harris, did not have his opening prayer all typed out in advance for the reporters. He spent much more time than the regular period preparing today's message. Here is part of his prayer. We pray today, he said, this day of days for our enemies, with calloused hearts and warped minds and poisoned conceptions. Forgive them. They know not what they do. Bring them to last with purged spirits in the united family of nations. And now, ladies and gentlemen, there are several senators and representatives with us today, and the first of them is Senator Bennett Clark of Missouri, a veteran of the last war, you may remember. He spends most of his time these days working on veterans' legislation for the men who today are going ashore in Europe on the greatest invasion effort of all time. Senator Clark, you know, is author of the GI Bill of Rights, now in the Senate. And while a soldier, incidentally, you may remember that he and Teddy Roosevelt, Jr. organized the American Legion. Won't you tell us something about that, Senator Clark, and give us some message for today?
Mr. Brady, in this moment of destiny, when our boys are jumping off in the greatest military adventure of all time, the American people may have the satisfaction of knowing that our Army comprises the best trained, the best equipped, best armed, best fed, and the best clothed Army that the United States has ever sent into action.
I know we're all glad of that, Senator. Thank you very much, sir. And now I see Congresswoman Claire Booth Luce of Connecticut. She's wearing that new hairdo, by the way, the one with the braids. Mrs. Luce, would you say something for us today?
This is the hour that marks the beginning of the battle for the world. We know that this is the true name for the battle, for if we were to lose it, we'd lose our supreme chance to lead in the councils of peace and to guide our nations towards a brighter destiny. We will win this battle for the world. There's no one in our nation who doubts it, because we know that our arms are strong and our hearts are firm, and there is faith in our souls. In this moment of faith and victory for our arms, I find myself thinking not so much of our men who have crossed the Channel or who are still to cross. I'm thinking of the mothers and fathers and wives who wait and listen and wait at home. How heavy and cold is the fear in each heart for the dear one. How time drags and crawls and creeps and yet will not stand still until some news of him, of that one boy, of that one man, comes to you. A mother or a father or a woman in love dies 1,000 deaths a day waiting and listening. The other women have known the cruel pain of that long vigil that now faces you. They can only tell you this: believe in God, accept His will with love. Your man's fighting well for his country. His weapons are of the best. His leaders in the field are tough and wise. And the one thing that he would want is for you at home to be of good cheer, so that you, in your courage, may set as fine an example as he is setting among his own comrades today in arms.
Thank you, Mrs. Luce. Yours is the honor of interpreting for all of us the reactions of mothers throughout the United States. Now I wanted to Senator Alban Barkley of Kentucky, who has sons in this war, would speak a word to you today.
I'm sure that everybody in the United States, if not everybody in the world, has been thrilled this morning by the news of our invasion of Europe. I feel sure that all of the impatience which may have been exhibited prior to this date will fade when we consider that it has been the duty of our government and of our allied governments to prepare for this invasion to the last man, the last tank, the last airplane, the last round of ammunition, in order that when we made the adventure, we should go forward in it. I can only say, as I feel the same suspense that must be felt by millions of parents all over the United States, we should fervently and devoutly pray deep down in our hearts that the God of justice and of peace may bring victory to our troops and to those of our allies at the earliest possible moment. And I might conclude this brief comment by quoting from an old church hymnal which I learned when I was a boy. This is the hour I long have sought and mourned because I found it not.
Thank you, Senator Barkley. I myself, a veteran of many years on the Hill, not as many as you, of course, have seen this spirit of prayer among the representatives and senators of our nation. It's one of the most inspiring hours of my career on the Hill at any rate. And now, Senator White of Maine, the minority leader, the leader for the Republicans, the opposition on Capitol Hill on the Senate side. Senator, would you say a word for us today?
Mr. Beatty, this is one of the momentous days in the world's history. It is shadowed with a possibility of disaster, but it has within it the substantial promise of a glorious ending. Wherever the men and the women of our country may be this day, they fight, they work, and they pray for victory, for justice, for peace, with all the blessings which these will bring to the peoples of the earth. We have abiding faith that in his appointed time, God of battles and the God of peace will give triumphant victory to the right and will worst the forces of evil.
Thank you, Senator White of Maine. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be interested to know that our guests here today, most of them are speaking to you right out of their hearts and minds. They haven't prepared anything. They've just come by the Senate Radio Gallery to speak a word at our request. And now, Senator Lester Hill of Alabama, who you may know is a war veteran and has long been head of the House Military Committee in years gone by. Senator Hill.
Our invasion constitutes the most stupendous military task ever undertaken in all the history of the world. It's not possible for us today to know the infinite preparation, the careful and detailed plans that have been made for this invasion.
Senator, may I interrupt with a bulletin at this time?
Certainly. Go ahead, Mr.
We have a bulletin from Supreme Allied Headquarters, Expeditionary Force. It says, our forces have, by evening of this day, gotten over the first 5 or 6 hurdles in the greatest amphibious assault of all times. Now, Senator Hill again.
This is good news that we've made such progress. We can be thankful that we have made such progress, but we must all be prepared for terrific counterattacks that will be made by the Germans. I was speaking of the plans that have been made, the infinite preparation for this invasion. We can't know these plans now, but I think as a member of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs, I can say to the mothers and fathers of our young men and young women who are struggling on the beaches today that our military and naval commanders have taken every possible precaution, have done everything humanly possible to protect and save every life they can, to keep whole every body that they can. Today we salute these heroic young men and young women. And for us it should be an hour of dedication, an hour in which we dedicate ourselves to the one thought and the one purpose, that we here at home will do that which will best support, best sustain, and best back up these heroic young men and young women, and that we will also resolve that we will play our part in the building of a peace, so that the sacrifices that our young men and young women are making today will not be made in vain.
Thank you, Senator Hill of Alabama. We've now heard from several of our representatives on the Hill and our senators. The important message, I think, that all of them gave us, the main thing they stressed, is the fact that America goes into this war prepared. I think all of them, pardonably, must be thanked for the effort they made to be sure that the armed services got everything they asked for in the war effort in the last 2 years. Never before in history has so much money been given to the Army and the Navy. Never has so much cooperation and unified spirit moved the efforts of Congress, despite many, many arguments on the sidelines as time went on. Today we've heard Congresswoman Claire Booth Luce speaking for the mothers of the nation, speaking the message that they would have, most of them, if they were here with us today. And now we have a bulletin from London. It says that Hermann Goering has issued an order of the day to the German air forces that the invasion of Western Europe must be fought off, even if it means the death of the Luftwaffe. Ladies and gentlemen, that would seem to be the beginning of preparations for the German counterattack. As Senator Hill told us a few moments ago, we must be prepared for terrific counterattacks by the Germans. They have not yet launched any such attacks. As a matter of fact, most of the congressmen and the senators I've talked to this morning have said, oh, how well it would be if we could only expect them to move right on in there. But we all know it can't be that way. The counterattack is the thing that's coming, and the counterattack in this particular zone of Europe, where the Germans are much closer to supply lines than we are, have not the hurdle of water to cross. That counterattack must be expected. That's why most of the men who spoke to you this morning, who know their map of Europe, who studied specially the strategy of this situation in the European area, they know that great losses are ahead of us in the next few moments. That's all for now from the Capitol in Washington. We return you just a moment. We have a bulletin from London. Kenneth Banghart with a new bulletin.
A bulletin from the NBC newsroom in Washington. It's just been announced in London by Prime Minister Winston Churchill that Allied troops have penetrated several miles inland at some points after landings on the French coast. And now we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Back in the NBC newsroom in New York, and here is Don Goddard with more news flashes.
Winston Churchill has just made a second appearance before the House of Commons in London, and he has had this to say about the events of the day's invasion. He says, "I can state that this operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner." He says this also, the members of the House of Commons. "Many dangers and difficulties which this time last night appeared extremely formidable are now behind us. The passage of the sea has been made with far less loss than we apprehended." Those are the words of Winston Churchill speaking before the House of Commons in London at a second meeting today. Mr. Churchill had gone before the House of Commons earlier today and had told of the great armada of ships, the great fleets of airplanes, which we were sending over to secure our beachhead. He told us then, you remember, that the astronomical figure of 11,000 planes had been used, that 4,000 ships were standing in the channel, great warships bombarding the coast where our men were landing. And he said today, later on, coast artillery, that is, the Germans' coast artillery in defense, was far less effective than anticipated. And our headquarters are saying that the invasion was made possible only through the excellent work of minesweepers. Rough weather marked the start of the undertaking, and several landing barges were swamped. The German forces resisting the Allies are believed to be under the command of Nazi Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The spokesman at headquarters said he expressed the belief that the Germans have between 1,500 and 2,000 fighter planes available when they want to use them against our fleet of 11,000 planes. The Allied High Command revealed today that the invasion of Western Europe originally was scheduled to take place yesterday, but had to be postponed for 24 hours because of the bad weather. This is Don Goddard speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York.
We pause briefly now for station identification.
This is WEAF, New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, the National Broadcasting Company takes you across country with stop-offs at other key NBC news points for a roundup of the domestic reaction on this greatest military story of all time. NBC newsmen are now at their microphones in Cleveland, Chicago, Denver, Hollywood, and San Francisco. We shall hear from them in that order. And so, for a close-up of what the nation is thinking and feeling this very momentous day, NBC in New York switches you across the continent. For our first report, we take you to NBC in Cleveland.
This is Edward Wallace in Cleveland. Here in the nation's fifth largest city, the people met the news of invasion with a spirit of quiet determination. Like the rest of the nation, most Clevelanders were asleep when the first word came. But in Cleveland's war plants, the news reached the war workers at the moment it was first announced. Radio loudspeakers brought the first bulletins to them. Work halted briefly. Only a few cheered, but most of them just stood quietly by their lates, offering a short prayer for the safety and victory of their loved ones. Then back to their vital war jobs with fresh vigor. The same spirit pervades the crowds on Cleveland streets. No cheers or any similar outburst. Here outside the NBC building, for instance, a crowd of men and women has been growing ever since the first word of the invasion came from Europe early this morning. They've been standing there for hours, listening to each bulletin as it comes through the NBC loudspeakers. Their faces are somber, and they are following each development with serious intentness. One woman spoke the mood of most Clevelanders. She's got a boy over in England, a signal corpsman, and it's probable that he was part of the invasion force that stormed ashore on the coast of Normandy. Her reaction to invasion? It's this: I've asked God to give us victory and take care of my son, and I know he will. All over Cleveland and in other parts of Ohio, too, church doors have swung open, and the people are taking time out of their day-to-day duties for prayer and meditation. Mayor Lauschie of Cleveland was one of the public officials with a special message for the people. Said Lauschie, "The command to us is to stand forth and stay at our civilian posts with increased vigor and devotion. We must humbly and solemnly pray for our youth. They are in a gigantic and perilous task and need every bit of help that we can give." And then he attended an early church service before he, too, went to work. Ohio's Governor, John Bricker, calls today the beginning of the end for the forces of evil. And in the little towns around Cleveland and elsewhere in Ohio, special prayers are being offered up to hasten that end. And in the schools also, the children bowed their heads in special prayers. High up on top of Ohio's tallest building, the railroad terminal tower in Cleveland, a symbol was hoisted today. It's a 30-foot banner of black and gold, flying briskly under the stars and stripes. It was designed by the Cleveland Civilian Defense as a herald of the invasion. It will stay there until the invasion has succeeded. This is Edward Wallace in Cleveland. I switch you now to NBC in Chicago.
This is Alex Dreyer speaking. Chicago's usually noisy loop was calm today. There were no excited groups on street corners, no newsboys shouting the advent of D-Day. Hotel lobbies were strangely silent, and everywhere Chicagoans received the momentous news soberly and with a prayer on their lips. Governor Green of Illinois and Mayor Kelly of Chicago both have proclaimed this a day of prayer, and churches of all denominations are holding special services throughout the day. As early as 5 a.m. Central Time, the bells began pealing their summons for early masses in the Roman Catholic churches. And as dawn was breaking, many men and women in overalls, returning from their work on the night shifts, entered their churches to pray. Brief special prayer services were arranged quickly in many of the larger defense plants, and it was the same throughout the Middle West. The bells of the old cathedral at Vincennes, Indiana, the first church in the Northwest Territory, rang out early this morning. Chicago's spirit of prayerful determination was reflected in other ways, too. Absenteeism in war plants, large and small, fell to a new low, and everywhere workers followed the news of the invasion eagerly, speeding up their work as they did. At the huge Dodge Chrysler plant, largest airplane motor plant in the world, NBC's latest invasion bulletins were posted on the bulletin boards for passing employees to read. To the military in the Chicago area, however, today was just another day in the war, to be devoted, as always, to ordinary duty. At Fort Sheridan, only the gods knew of the attack. The rest of the post slept, and the thousands of sailors at Great Lakes, Illinois, awakened with the usual grumbling at the bugler's call. But they gave forth with cheers and shouting when the mess hall loudspeaker blared out Eisenhower's official announcement that the invasion was finally on. Chicago and the Middle West have taken the news calmly, but the little city of Linton, Indiana, could only sit and wait, because shortly after the invasion flash last night, the power generator in Linton blew out, cutting off all teletypes and radios in the community. The hope of many throughout the Midwest was probably expressed best by a little incident in an all-night Chicago restaurant. Upon hearing the invasion flash, a blonde in a sweeping pale blue formal gown bowed her head in a moment of prayer, and at the next table a woman said, "Now, Sammy will be back home pretty soon." We take you now to NBC in Denver.
This is Ivan Schooley in Denver. The news of the Allied invasion of Western Europe was taken calmly and quietly in Denver and other sections of the Rocky Mountain region. Since the news came when most people had retired for the night, many were not informed of the invasion until this morning, although sirens were blown in many cities as soon as the Allied command officially confirmed the landings. The siren served as a signal to many churches throughout the area to open church doors for prayers for the success of the Allied operations. Radio stations gave night-long reports on bulletins detailing the early announcements, and many newspapers put out special editions. Switchboards at radio stations were swamped with callers asking if the news was true. In Denver, when the official announcement came, only a few midnight stragglers were on the streets. However, in most hotels, the news electrified guests, although there were no demonstrations. Larry Martin, editor of the Denver Post, in analyzing the importance of this new action, pointed out that the magnitude of the Allied invasion staggers the imagination. He emphasized the fact that United Nations armies had successfully negotiated their first hurdle. However, he warned that the most difficult days are coming. A Denver street cleaner, weighed down by knee-high boots, stopped his work long enough to tell how he felt about the invasion. He said one of his sons is probably in it. He's been in England for months. And the cleaner added, "I'll keep sweeping the streets and let him sweep into Berlin." At Lowry Field, an Army base near Denver, Air Force ground school trainees stopped on their way to mess to pray for buddies who might be in the invasion vanguard. Special D-Day services were held. Then, the soldiers continued with their regular duties, as did military personnel at other camps. Across the Continental Divide in Salt Lake City, the invasion news was received calmly, and the man on the street seemed little surprised. Everyone apparently has just been waiting for the big push to start. Persons interviewed were unanimous in predicting success for the Allied expeditionary forces. Response to the word of the satisfactory progress of the landings in France was highlighted in war plans by comments in the Denver factories making landing craft. Workers expressed the hope that landing boats they had a part in making were in on the big event. Although there was tremendous interest in news of the invasion, war workers stuck to their jobs and worked with increased enthusiasm. And those are the highlights in the Rocky Mountain region of the response to announcement of the invasion of Europe. This is Ivan Schooley in Denver. Now to NBC in Hollywood.
First, we have a late bulletin from the Berlin radio. Berlin has just admitted that the beachhead on the European shores has been further widened. Local reaction in Southern California was what you'd expect of any American community. No hysterical rejoicing, pretty calm and quiet on the whole. No apathy, certainly not that, but a dignified and solemn acceptance of news awaited a long time. The impulse is definitely toward prayer, the general feeling, anxiety for the men who have history's toughest job. The three questions on everybody's lips are, how are we doing, where are we doing it, and what about casualties?
Quite a few people went to church this morning who haven't been to church in a long time, and special services are scheduled throughout the day. Grown-ups, pretty solemn about it all, are hanging close to their radios wherever possible. When the first news broke at war plants in Los Angeles, including Lockheed and Douglas, the workers cocked an ear to the announcement and then redoubled their efforts to turn out planes. Their feeling is one of tremendous responsibility. They've got a personal interest in those 11,000 planes which are covering the invasion attack. And in the back of most everybody's mind in this area is the thought, every mile closer to Berlin means we're another mile closer to Tokyo, too. Even the children have that idea. One little girl woke to the blare of neighborhood loudspeakers and asked, "What's all the noise about, Mother? Have we got those Japs where they belong?" A number of Southern Californians slept through the whole thing. There weren't many reports of sirens and ringing of bells. Most Hollywood streets show either people with bloodshot eyes, the ones who've had their ears glued to a loudspeaker all night, or those with a quicker step who received the momentous news upon awakening this morning. All faces, tired and rested, show relief from tension. In studio language, the typical Hollywood reaction was a double take. People heard the news, and then about 2 minutes later came up with startled faces and shouted, "Huh? What?" Here in Hollywood, one Marine who had just won a nightclub jitterbug contest, and all he said when he heard of the invasion announcement was, "I feel kind of silly." Most folks seem to feel that way who didn't have some kind of part to play, such as aircraft workers have in this community. We're all thinking about those planes which have come off Southern California's assembly lines and which now are darkening the skies over Hitler's Europe. The prayers of this part of the coast are riding the wings of the planes our workers built. The planes our sons are flying into that inferno over there. All we can say is, Godspeed and God bless our boys. This is NBC in Hollywood. We take you now to NBC in San Francisco.
This is Larry Smith speaking from San Francisco. I have just returned from a tour of the restaurants, the streets, and a short ride on a trolley car taking war workers to their jobs. To most San Franciscans, the invasion of the European continent was several hours old when they received the first word, because we're 3 hours late getting up than New Yorkers and the East Coast residents. But now, everywhere in this great port of embarkation, the funnel through which the tools of war and the men to work them flow into the far reaches of the Pacific, there seems to be one calm but understandable reaction. That is, that this is the first step toward the day when the full might of the Allies can be hurled against our other mutual enemy, Japan. It's an understandable reaction because the men in uniform here are headed for New Guinea, for the Philippines, at least someplace across the Pacific where they will face the Japanese. A leathery-faced Marine, campaign ribbons filling 3 rows above his breast pocket, turned to me and said, "Well, it had to happen, so what's all the shooting about? Didn't General Eisenhower say that it would be over in 1944? A young girl aboard the car, a girl in the metal hat of a shipyard worker, started to sob. Her husband is a paratrooper somewhere in England. That's where his last letter came from. Today, he's perhaps somewhere in France. A Chinese smiled. He saw in the defeat of Hitler the transfer of Allied power to help his staggering homeland. And Chinatown leaders started early this morning to build up a record sale of invasion bonds next week to speed the day of liberation for their country. An elderly woman stood up in the streetcar to announce proudly, "My boy is with General Eisenhower's forces. He'll be in the fight." Almost everyone saw the invasion of Hitler's European fortress as a forerunner of a stepped-up war against the Japanese. And that, too, is understandable, because the Pacific coast faces the enemy to the west rather than to the east. There is a general feeling that Russia will now enter the war against the Japs, that Stalin will grant the United States air bases, that we will invade the Kurils. Wild rumors run rampant, but beneath the surface the reaction was simply, "Let's go, General Eisenhower, because the quicker the defeat of Hitler, the quicker we can get at Hirohito." Yes, San Franciscans this morning feel they can hear the sizzling of that rising sun of Japan as it sinks into the torrent of righteous justice and retribution. They see the day when the Pacific will again be the Pacific.
We return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
This is Don Goddard back in the NBC newsroom in New York. And New York, the nation's metropolis, the news of the invasion was greeted here with calmness, too, with a spirit of prayer and with a full awareness of the meaning of this momentous occasion in history. Typical, perhaps, was the reaction of some 500 men and women at work in war production at their benches at the Bendix Aviation Corporation's plant over in Brooklyn. There, in the dark hours of this morning, they heard that news with a lusty cheer, and then they returned to their task to turn out more implements of war to carry on the great offensive. And the New York stock market reflected the confidence of American business in these parts. The market was quiet, and U.S. Treasury bonds held steady as a rock. And New York's racetracks were closed today, along with others throughout the country. In the Times Square district, where soldiers and sailors on furlough were still entertaining themselves and their girlfriends, there the servicemen stood in front of loudspeakers, hearing the news over the radio. And one sailor said, "I wish I'd been there myself." Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard the story of how the news of the invasion came to the United States of America, the reaction on the home front from stations in Cleveland, Chicago, Denver, Hollywood, San Francisco, and here from Don Goddard in the NBC newsroom in New York.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Some of the dangers and the difficulties which appeared at this time last night extremely formidable are already behind us. Passage of the sea was made with far less loss than was anticipated. The resistance of coastal batteries was greatly weakened by our bombing. In fact, it was weakened more than we had expected. And then the superior bombardment of our warships, which lent such valiant aid to our invading forces, quickly reduced the power of these batteries to such small dimensions that they did not effect our landing problem. The Allied landing forces have already penetrated several miles inland from several points on the French coast. Our airborne troops have captured several strategic bridges intact and are holding them pending the arrival of our mechanized forces. Fighting is proceeding for the possession of the city of Caen, one of the most important of Normandy, its chief rail center. The Allied invasion forces everywhere met less resistance than expected, and this is true in the approaches to the beachheads as well as in the air. The Germans told us in a bulletin just a few minutes ago that our invasion beachheads have been further widened. And an observer at Allied headquarters summed up the situation in these words: "We have gotten over the first 5 or 6 hurdles." Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force tells us that the Allied landings in France were postponed 24 hours due to bad weather. They were originally scheduled for yesterday morning, which might suggest that they were intended to be timed with the capture of Rome, for that would have started the invasion within 24 hours of the capture by Allied forces of the Eternal City. Our bombing effort reached a new climax yesterday and today. Some 2,300 United States and British bombers dropped 11,200 tons of bombs in 8½ hours. They were dropped on gun emplacements guarding the invasion coast. You must look to that air bombardment for a part of the explanation of our unexpectedly rapid progress in these first invasion stages. Despite this effort, the Allied air forces maintained effective air cover for our troops and for our naval forces. Remember, we have 11,000 first-line planes in Britain, and every one of them is swinging into action today. The first German fighter plane opposition to the invasion forces was reported this afternoon. There were many dogfights. It came at the very moment when Marshal Goering told his Luftforces, "This invasion must be fought off, even if it means the death of the Luftwaffe." That's not an optimistic statement to present to a defensive fighter force at this stage of the invasion. The British Prime Minister also announced this afternoon that the Allies had captured a number of important bridges, and he also said that the airborne landings were on a scale far larger than anything seen so far in the world. The Germans told us that we had landed 4 divisions of airborne troops. Yank, the paper published, Stars and Stripes, not Yank, the paper published in Naples tells us that we landed 30,000 paratroopers. Well, that would be the better part of the fighting force of 4 divisions. That, of course, is by far the largest number of troops ever landed from the air. The great invasion of Crete, which was a classic in paratroop landings, included only 1 division. And so here, our initial effort, 4 times as great and more to come. Admiral Ingersoll revealed in Washington that United States battleships, cruisers, and destroyers are participating in the invasion. It is their bombardment, theirs and that of the British warships, that has helped to silence many of these coastal batteries on which the Germans relied to hold off the invasion ships. The Germans claim that 1 cruiser was sunk, which is a mighty small claim when you consider the tremendous naval force that is involved in this action. Some may ask, why France instead of Belgium or Holland or Norway or Denmark? France is the beginning. France is nearest. France has been softened up. France has a strong underground. These are reasons enough for us to make our beginning in France. It's curious that in this invasion, some of the best news comes to us from the Nazis. The Paris radio said tonight, a vicious battle is raging north of Rouen between powerful Allied paratroop formations and German anti-invasion forces. These paratroops, the Paris radio says, landed behind the Atlantic Wall defenses. That is the encouraging thing, that our invasion technique has sufficed to put us behind that great Atlantic defense wall on which Hitler relied. This battle in Rouen is something that we have had no word of from Allied sources. But it's quite possible to remember that we have landed in the estuary of the Seine. That was announced early today, and Rouen is somewhat farther inland, 100 miles down the Seine, and is, of course, a tremendously important point. No, not 100 miles. Rouen must be something like 40 miles down the Seine from the harbor where we landed early this morning. 31,000 Allied airmen were over France from midnight to 8 a.m., and that does not count parachute and glider troops. The conference of the High Command in Washington with President Roosevelt has ended. Admiral King, commander of the United States Fleet, said after the conference with the President that the invasion of Europe is doing all right so far. And Admiral King is a conservative commentator. And so, as you look at the picture, you see everywhere initial Allied success. You see the result of the careful preparation of these past 2-3 years. You see the result of our experience in Sicily, in Africa, in Italy. We have learned, and what we have learned, we are putting into practice today. We have accumulated the necessary force. We have developed the necessary technique. Yes, there may be setbacks. There may be delays. But the story of these first hours of invasion tells us what we know in our hearts, that we are sure of victory and that it may come sooner than many of us had supposed. Good afternoon.
The National Broadcasting Company now presents Lieutenant Colonel James Stevenson, United States Army retired, a military analyst who looks upon our invasion operation from a background of personal experiences. For before his retirement, he was a member of the staff of that command which helped train our troops for the amphibious operations which they've undertaken today across the Channel, the direct assault on France. We present Colonel Stevenson.
Well, now that the invasion has actually started, and action seems to be moving rapidly, it is rather difficult to make out exactly where the spearhead is striking. But that is unimportant. The latest reports indicate that the landing at Le Havre was a major stroke. Our troops are moving in quickly and fanning out. It appears that we have made a serious threat to the German right flank in the defense of the long French Atlantic coastline. As this action proceeds, I believe you will see more landings along this coastline, for here are the huge harbors and docking facilities that we must have to maintain a great force of men in Europe. Great West Coast ports with docking and railroad facilities that we need to supply a great army. We used those facilities in the last war, and we need them again. Without them, we are pinched for room to operate. With them, we have breathing space and a chance to organize our great land forces for the push toward the east. As the great beachhead at Le Havre develops and we push further inland, we offer more and more a threat to the Nazi defenses along the coastline. There will be only one way for the Germans to save themselves, and that will be to draw back. Otherwise, they will take the chance of being pocketed along that west coast. And as they draw back toward their inner defenses, they will find the roads difficult because they do not run parallel to each other, as in Germany. Oh, no. The French roads radiate from central points, which is natural to France's terrain. The country is laid out as in layers, something like saucers, one on top of the other, the bigger saucers on the bottom. And each rim is a natural obstacle to get over. And it is because of the natural terrain that the Allied command must have those West Coast ports. Now, there's been some speculation that there might be an invasion from the south, from the Mediterranean. I do not believe it is necessary, for as our forces drive down from Normandy, where they landed today, and as they move into the West Coast ports, the Nazis will be compelled to pull out of the south to save themselves. Their only other alternative is to be trapped against the Alps mountains in the east, where the few roads will not be sufficient to allow escape. So in all probability, the action within the next few days will develop south from Le Havre in fast, bold strokes, with new landings to be made on the Atlantic or Bay of Biscay coast. There is the possibility that we will try to move down to Paris, about 110 miles away, as quickly as possible for its psychological effect, just as we drove up the long, rocky Italian coast to take Rome. The prestige and the happy effect it would have upon all the shackled people of Europe would be invaluable, because we must remember that part of our strategy is to get these people actively working for and supporting our forces. But the important thing now is getting those West Coast ports, squeezing the Nazis out of that part of France. And the action seems to indicate that that is exactly what we're doing. We must remember that armies need tremendous amounts of supplies, and that everything which is being done now is based on that fact. We must get the docks, we must get the harbors, and our forces are driving down from Le Havre to ensure that we do get them. The Nazi-operated Paris radio, quoting a last-minute flash from the battlefield, says that a vicious battle is raging north of Rouen between powerful Allied paratroop formations and German anti-invasion forces. The Paris radio says these paratroops landed behind the Atlantic wall defenses. And further indicating tougher going, here's a bulletin which says, a bulletin from London, Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, in an order of the day, told Nazi airmen that the invasion must be fought off, even if it means the death of the Luftwaffe. Earlier, though, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in his second report to Commons today on the Allied invasion of Western Europe, said that on the basis of the latest information from the front, and I'm quoting him now, I can state to the House that this operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner. And even the German DNB agency said at 6:30 p.m. London time that the invasion has further widened. According to the German version this morning, then, several landings were made both east and west of Le Havre. They are expecting more landings to the west, and well they may. The action will develop to the south and west until the Germans are driven east toward Paris and the Belgian frontier from which they came.
Thank you, Colonel Stevenson. The National Broadcasting Company has just brought you a military analysis of our invasion operations by Lieutenant Colonel Stevenson, USA retired, an expert on amphibious operations.
On this historic D-Day, the day of invasion, the news comes thick and fast in the early hours of this morning, at a time when most of the nation slept. It was then, for instance, that we got the exciting report from Merrill Muller, NBC's correspondent at General Eisenhower's headquarters, of how the correspondents themselves were brought up to date on the operation. And for the benefit of those who did not hear that broadcast, NBC now presents a transcription of the historic report.
If I never attend another press conference in my life, I shall certainly remember this one. Perhaps because its outstanding factor was that it was more like a staff conference than a general's talk to newspapermen. Here's the picture. Remember that all around us, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men were readying themselves for the outbreak of the battle that all the world had waited for 4 long, dark years. Men from the far corners of the world ready to erase the stain of Dunkirk, to lift the shrouds of Nazi tyranny, to crush the Axis in the growth of the United Nations. Airplanes growled overhead. Ships were gathering and steaming off into the channel, and final road convoys rumbled into the embarkation areas. We all sprawled around the general's private field office and were given the picture. In a tiny tent, some 15 feet square, we sat and listened to the most amazing delivery of dynamic facts I have ever heard. We overcrowded and spilled half out of the tent onto its backyard concrete terrace. It is a modest office. The inner wall of the tent is half lined from the ground up with slats from packing cases. And some ingenious sergeant has stained those slats into imitation fine paneling. The floor is concrete with a couple of rope rugs. There's one desk, a telephone, 2 chairs, and a moderate wall mat. Otherwise, the tent show is the tree-shaded terrace and 3 pieces of deck chair furniture. You have to tear your eyes from the general to note these things because he holds your interest completely. When you appreciate his tremendous command of facts and figures, duplicated, I think, only by General Marshall, you understand why he was picked for this assignment. It is not opportune to release the details of our briefing on behalf of the general, except in 3 general ways. 1, he wanted all the credit for this campaign to go to the common soldiers of the Allied armies, and he emphasized the lower ranks and the word Allied. His order of the day takes that vein. 2, he had nothing but praise for the untiring efforts and inexhaustible research of his various staffs and his various commanders for air, sea, armies, and supplies. 3, as to the actual plan itself, perhaps I can best put it this way. I have been in on all of General Eisenhower's amphibious assaults, but none was as involved or as mammoth as this one. Last-minute headaches? Yes, the general had a last-minute headache, and he expressed it beautifully when he suddenly jumped from his chair and said, "Good heavens, there's some sunshine." Otherwise, the invasion of Europe had already been packed for days. We came out of the tent and strolled toward his proudest, newest possession, just the general and myself. He praised his new mobile office, a super deluxe job built into a 10-ton truck and trailer and presented to him by the Lockheed workers here. And then I asked him about his own nerves. He stopped, hatless in the sun. He is supposed to be phlegmatic, but he said quietly, "I'm so gall-darn nervous I boil over." He's not supposed to show it. He didn't either. I caught him only twice, wringing his hands or jiggling his English change. But I like reporting that he is human enough to feel what the lowliest of his troops feel. We went to a parachuter space just before their takeoff for France. For this invasion, the general honors his vast airborne forces that are now employed in battle. We went from airfield to airfield, talking to the airborne troops and to the Air Force crews that flew them to their targets. The general's car would roll up, and always the procedure was the same. The men would snap to attention, sneaking a final chew on their gum as they did so. Their faces were smeared with cocoa and linseed oil. It gave a Halloween twist to their grins. When the general ordered them to stand easy, he would move among them. "Where are you from?" General Ike would ask one boy. "What did you do in civilian life? How old are you? Are you a good shot with that rifle? What do you weigh? Who's the toughest man in the battalion?" And so it went down the line. And invariably, off in another corner of the field, the men would start shouting for Ike. Yes, just Ike. And over he'd go, repeating the questions all over again, verbally sparring with them, giving them the impression that this general was just one of the guys who thought they were the best soldiers in the world. One boy said he was an expert rifleman. Good, said the general. That's what will win for you tonight. From one quick-witted youngster, the general was told that the toughest man in the battalion would be selected after they jumped in France. Good, said the general. Send him back to me and I'll have something for him. But the visit was brief. The yell went down the line to load plane 1, and the men started trooping off. General Ike yelled good luck and saluted them time after time. This outfit had been assigned the toughest mission of all. They knew it, and the general knew it. And both are part of a winning team. Soon, hundreds of planes were circling overhead in the gathering gloom, their warm yellow lights making them look like huge, horizontal Christmas trees rushing into the night. They took formation and disappeared toward the channel, extinguishing their lights to make their approach as the first wave to strike on the second front. His face raised to their thundering black shapes, General Eisenhower watched the planes disappear toward France. Nothing to do now but sweat it out back at the camp. Try to read a cheap murder mystery or a wild westerner. Refrain from calling any of the commanders for news. Just hang on and wait. A stroll down the path with slippers and robe and another cigarette. A pause to hear the faint passage of a fleet of bombers. A game of checkers or gin rummy with Commander Butcher. Will the night never end? Phlegmatic? But when his men have left him behind, he's with them always, just the same. The battle has been joined until his men appeal to him for his renewed assistance. As the campaign takes more definite shape from its fluid beachhead, the general will take his chance and wait.
That was how it started. Then our troops launched the great assault. That assault, too, was officially announced in an historic broadcast at 3:32 o'clock this morning Eastern War Time. Communique number 1 from the Supreme Allied Headquarters. Here is the recording of that dramatic message.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
NBC has just brought you on transcription 2 historic broadcasts, reports by which the nation first heard of the Allied invasion of the continent in the early hours of this morning.
This is the NBC newsroom in New York. We now continue with a program of music.
And now we bring you Tommy Taylor and tailor-made songs with Irving Miller and his orchestra. This program of music will be interrupted immediately on receiving news of the invasion front.
saw me standing alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. Blue moon, you knew just what I was there for. You heard me sing a prayer for someone I really could care for. And then there suddenly appeared before me the only one my arms will ever hold. I heard somebody whisper, please adore me. And when I looked, the moon had turned to gold. Blue moon, now I'm no longer alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. And then there suddenly appeared before me the only one my arms will ever hold. I heard somebody whisper, please adore me. And when I looked, the moon had turned to gold. Blue moon, now I'm no longer alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own.
You have been listening to songs by Tommy Taylor, music by Irving Miller and his orchestra, coming to you from New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company. .1:30 Eastern Wartime, your station, WEAF, New York.
Continuing its up-to-the-minute coverage of the Allied invasion of northern France, the National Broadcasting Company now presents Don Hollenbeck. Mr. Hollenbeck is heard regularly from the New York studios of NBC and has seen lengthy foreign service. He was formerly heard from Italy, where he covered that campaign, notably the Allied landing at Salerno. Mr. Hollenbeck.
First, a reminder to listen to the broadcast from NBC of King George, 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime over your NBC station. Guinea pigs used for experimental purposes seldom live to talk about the experiment. As one of the guinea pigs for this invasion of Europe today, I'm lucky enough to be alive to give a guinea pig's reaction to the real thing. Africa, Sicily, and Italy were the laboratories. At Salerno, we got the final tests. The lessons learned by the Fifth Army at Salerno are in a large part responsible for these initial successes today. The battles aren't won yet by any means, but some of the failures and shortcomings at Salerno are being turned to good account as the Allies pour into Western Europe. Lesson number 1, you've got to have air power, plenty of air power to cover the landing operations. We didn't have it, and at that time it was simply impossible to get it. Our fighter planes had to make round trips from Sicily. We had no landing strips any closer than that, and there weren't any carrier-based craft to cover us up. The long round trips meant the Air Forces had very little time to spend protecting us. Half an hour, 45 minutes at the most. Consequently, for a good part of the time, the only planes over us were Ju-88s, Me-109s, FW-190s. We were never sure from one moment to the next that our narrow hole in the Salerno beach wouldn't be blasted loose for the dive bombers. How different today. Under that tremendous umbrella of 11,000 aircraft of all types, the Allies have absolute mastery of the air over the invasion beaches. And I know how much better the earthbound soldiers in Normandy must be feeling this afternoon because they know that air umbrella is over their heads. No chance of it leaking to let death and destruction through. Lesson number 2, sea power. We rolled up the Mediterranean from various points in Africa and Sicily under escort, of course, but the escort was the barest minimum, no more than could absolutely be spared to protect the invading force. The navies had other jobs to do, other points at which to stand guard. As we hit the beach, there were a few destroyers, a few cruisers at our backs, the Dido and Mauritius, I remember, blasting away behind us at the German shore positions. It was several days before the really big stuff could get up. Those were the bad days when the German armored divisions were smashing down the Sealy River, and it looked as if our visit to Italy might be a short and a bitter one. Finally they came, our own Pennsylvania, the British Warspite and Valiant, stood at our backs and sent tons of metal screaming over our heads and into the well-concealed German gun positions that were themselves battering a path for the German armored divisions and striking out to sea to hold up our landing of the reinforcements and supplies that were so badly needed. Looking back, it seems to me to be a draw whether it was air cover we finally got or the sea power that finally pulled up to back us up and take care of the German positions. It was impossible for the land forces to get at. Impossible for our little force of bombers to locate in those wild hills that end so abruptly in the Gulf of Salerno with only a little beach between them and the sea. Again, how different today. The mightiest sea force ever assembled. 4,000 ships to stand offshore and cover the landing forces. Undoubtedly, some of those ships that backed us up at Salerno and in Africa and Sicily are standing off the coast of Normandy today. As one of the guinea pigs who came back, I can speak with feeling about what a difference this makes to men who must do the grubby, dirty, bloody job of war. The infantrymen, the airborne troops, the paratroopers who must come to close grips with a savage enemy. You get as near a feeling of confidence as you can get when you know that there's air power to keep off the enemy planes, sea power to silence the big guns lying hidden in front of you. We used to grumble at the sound of our 16-inchers, our own 3.7 slugging at the Germans. It was the kind of comfortable grumbling you do when you're comparatively safe. Men in panic, men in momentary fear of their lives have no time to grumble. There's probably some of that same kind of grousing going on in Normandy at this very moment. Veterans of other campaigns can get a little long-winded comparing and second-guessing. At the risk of that, I believe the men of the Fifth Army in that little arc of the beaches of Salerno contributed a great deal to these landings today. Those who didn't come back from the beaches of Salerno, those who came back maimed but alive, to them is owing a great debt that every one of us, every soldier going into France today, every airman and every sailor must not forget.
Thank you, Don Hollenbeck. This is the NBC newsroom in New York, ladies and gentlemen, and in just 10 seconds, we're going to take you to London for a special broadcast. Stand by, if you will, and then again, we'll hear from Don Hollenbeck. Go ahead, London. Just one moment, please. We're trying to establish contact with London. Go ahead, London. NBC Newsroom in New York. We're sorry that we can't establish contact there with London at this time. Just as soon as we're able to overcome the technical difficulties, we'll take you there. But in the meantime, here is Don Hollenbeck once again.
And here's some more detail on Prime Minister Churchill's second statement of the day. The Prime Minister said tonight Allied troops had penetrated in some cases several miles inland after effective landings on the French coast on a broad front. The Prime Minister said he had visited the various centers where the latest information was received and could state that this operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner. Many dangers and difficulties which appeared at this time last night extremely formidable are behind us, the war leader reported. Passage of the sea has been made with far less loss than we apprehended, Mr. Churchill said. The resistance of batteries has been greatly weakened by bombing by the Air Force, and the superior bombardment of our ships quickly reduced their power to dimensions which did not affect the problem. And here still more on Churchill's statement, the Prime Minister announces that Allied airborne troops had captured several strategic bridges in France before they could be blown up. And there is even fighting proceeding in the town of Caen. Churchill, addressing the House of Commons after a visit to General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in company with King George, described the landing of airborne troops on the European continent as an outstanding feat on a scale far larger than anything there has been seen so far in the world. And another reminder now, listen to King George at 3 p.m. over your NBC station, 3 p.m. King George. Continuing with the Prime Minister, these landings took place with extremely little loss and great accuracy. Earlier, the Prime Minister told the cheering House that the Allied liberating assault was proceeding according to plan, and what a plan. Just a year ago today, I was broadcasting from London for NBC. This story led the broadcast, and I quote, "When the great day of invasion comes, and it can't be far away, the British Navy is ready. Never before has the Navy been in a stronger position. The spirit of the crews has never been higher. They know that now they will go into action with an air umbrella sufficiently powerful to offset the efforts of the diamond torpedo bombers that have been their greatest worry since the war began. Britain has built 1,000 warships since 1939. Units of this great fleet are already at battle stations, ready for the signal. Well, that was 1 year ago today. That broadcast might have been given moments before this great news came today. And if it was the situation 1 year ago, it isn't difficult to know with what spirit the men of the Allies went into France today. 1 year has seen the growth of those navies and air forces to proportions probably not dreamed of then. If ever we were ready to strike, we were ready today. At Salerno, sometimes we wondered if it wasn't too little and too soon. We held on by the skin of our teeth, but we held on. Today, the word must be enough and at the right moment. And here's a late bulletin. President Roosevelt's top military, naval, and air chieftains reported to him today that the massive Allied cross-channel assault is doing well up to now. The invasion is doing all right so far, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, said as he left the White House after an hour-and-a-half's conference with the Chief Executive. And another late report, Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, says more than 10,000 tons of explosives were showered on invasion coastal targets by an estimated 31,000 airmen in the 8-hour period between midnight yesterday and 8 a.m. today.
Now, once again, we'll try to establish contact with London. NBC Newsroom in New York, we take you now to London.
The time has come to deal the enemy a terrific blow in Western Europe. The blow will be struck by the combined sea, land, and air forces of the Allies, together constituting one great Allied team under the supreme command of General Eisenhower. On the eve of this great adventure, I send my best wishes to every soldier in the Allied team. To us is given the honor of striking a blow for freedom which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings. We have a great and a righteous cause. Let us pray that the Lord, mighty in battle, will go forth with our armies, and that his special providence will aid us in the struggle. I want every soldier to know that I have complete confidence in the successful outcome of the operations that we are now about to begin. With stout hearts and with enthusiasm for the contest, let us go forward to victory. And as we enter the battle, let us recall the words of a famous soldier spoken many years ago. These are the words he said. He either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small, who dare not put it to the touch, to win or lose it all. Good luck to each one of you, and good hunting on the mainland of Europe.
This is the NBC Newsroom here in New York. And here is Don Hollenbach with further comment.
First, a bulletin from Folkestone. German guns across the English Channel opened fire at 5 p.m. today for the second time since the invasion began, but ceased as soon as Royal Air Force planes appeared over them. You remember Joan Ellis, the 22-year-old British teletype operator who sent that false flash 3 days ago reporting the European invasion. Well, Joan is happily remembered by newspaper editors now that D-Day has finally arrived. Newsmen found time to message expressions of agreement with James P. Roseman, managing editor of the Akron, Ohio Beacon Journal, who said, based on Joan Ellis' statement, asking America to forgive me, suggest AP editors cable message to her. Ours would be, no one in Ohio concerned about invasion flash. Good luck and carry on. And incidentally, that voice you just heard from London was General Montgomery. Good word and good cheer to his troops. More about Joan Ellis. Tell the British girl who flashed the invasion Saturday that we all love her and that she scooped the world. The South Bend, Indiana Tribune message, please cable Joan Ellis that Indiana thinks you knew it all the time. And now a moment for a look at other war theaters. There the news is not so good as it is from Europe. The Fourth Battle of Changsha opened yesterday as Japanese troops advancing along several routes reached the outer defenses of the key Hunan province stronghold the Chinese High Command announces tonight. 3 times in the past 6 years, the Chinese have hurled back the invaders from the gates of the city, barring enemy control of the Hankow-Canton Railroad, but the latest Japanese offensive appears the most determined of all. One Japanese column reached Changsha's outskirts after pushing down the roadbed of the Hankow-Canton Railway from captured Kuai-yi, while another enemy spearhead advanced from Pingkayang, 50 miles northwest of Changsha. On the left bank of the Central China Front, the invaders broke into Yuanqiang on the south shore of Lake Tangping, 50 miles northwest of Changsha, the communique says, and were attacking Yiyang, Sioux River town, 48 miles northwest of the Hunan capital. And according to the OWI, a late bulletin, Radio France in Algiers has broadcast a statement by André Le Troquet, French commissioner for the administration of liberated territories in metropolitan France. He declares the liberation of France has started. And one more reminder, 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime, King George over your NBC station. Don't fail to hear King George, 3 p.m. over your NBC station. And now a brief roundup. Allied invasion armies landed in northwestern France today, drove at least 9.5 miles into the German West Wall to the town of Caen. After 12 hours of fighting, they held beachheads on a broad front along the coast of Normandy.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard a news report by Don Hollenbeck of the National Broadcasting Company's news staff. We suggest that you stay dialed to NBC for the latest details and for each development of this invasion operation. We're making every effort to bring you this story just as it unfolds, or rather as it is unfolded to us here in the NBC newsroom in New York, the crossroads of the news. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
WEAF, New York.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its invasion coverage from Washington as we bring you now Morgan Beatty from the NBC newsroom in Washington. Mr. Beatty.
General Eisenhower's Supreme Allied Headquarters in London tonight reflects the air of optimism that pervades the regular news report. A headquarters spokesman said this: at about 7 p.m. London time, opposition in all quarters was less than expected. Allied naval losses were very, very small. Casualties in the first attacks were less than expected. Coastal gunfire was sporadic. Only 50 German planes were sighted over the invasion coast area in the first 8 hours of assault. Allied planes, for their part, dumped 10,000 tons of bombs out of 7,500 planes, and still the air armadas take off from Britain. There's divided opinion as to why the Germans failed to meet the first wave of Allied forces, the wave that pierced the invasion coast, up to 12 miles on the original thrust. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself made a careful inspection of all reports tonight, and in London, he said, you remember, he says that the Allies did not achieve tactical surprise, or rather did achieve tactical surprise. This, however, does not mean strategic surprise. There's a difference. For those of us who don't know our military terms, there's a difference between tactical and strategic surprise. What the Prime Minister was saying was this: The Germans knew, because of its nature, our general plan to assault the coasts of Europe. They did not know the time and the place, so they were surprised in a given area, but not in a general way. That's the difference between tactical and strategic surprise in military assault. The Germans, we can now report, had no opportunity to guess the timing of invasion, because General Dwight Eisenhower was the man who set that time. He had it set for Monday, yesterday, and because of bad weather, he changed his mind and put the great assault off for 24 hours. A few minutes ago, here in Washington, Admiral Ernest King of the Navy and General George Marshall and General Henry H. Arnold visited the White House. General Arnold, of course, is with the Air Forces. They discussed war reports with the President. They had nothing to say about their conference with the Chief Executive when they came out. Only one of the three had anything to say about the invasion itself. Quite fittingly, it was Admiral King of the Navy, the service that helped the Royal Navy put the invasion troops ashore in France. Admiral King shares the cautious optimism of Mr. Churchill. Invasion, he told reporters, is doing all right so far. The others smiled as if in complete agreement. It seems, therefore, at the moment, that cautious optimism is warranted. The Germans did not have the coastal defense system at the point of attack that they should have had, and for reasons that do not appear in the news report at this time. But optimism must be tempered with the realization that the enemy has not yet committed his skilled Air Force, what's left of it, nor his veteran reserves in Western Europe. He's counting on those reserves for counterattack. But let's go to the Pentagon building across the river from Washington for a military interview that will cover this and other points. Go ahead, NBC Pentagon.
Here in our NBC broadcasting booth in the Pentagon building are two American Army officers who've recently returned from the European theater of operations. Both were on hand to witness the final preparatory stages for D-Day. They are Colonel Robert O. Montgomery of the Field Artillery, whose present assignment is at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and Lieutenant Colonel John R. Ulmer of the Infantry, who is stationed in Washington as assistant editor of the Infantry Journal. Both Colonel Montgomery and Colonel Ulmer went to England as observers for the Army Ground Forces. Colonel Montgomery, I believe the people at home would very much like to know the extent of the training of our troops for this invasion. You saw many of these troops in England. Can you tell us something about them?
The troops of the Army Ground Forces in England were either veterans of combat in other theaters or troops that had undergone complete basic unit training in the United States. The troops who had seen combat in other theaters showed extreme confidence in their ability to carry out their missions. They were all anxious to get it over with, to go into combat as soon as possible. Their physical condition was excellent, their morale of the highest.
Now, what about the troops that hadn't seen combat, Colonel? The men fresh from the States.
The troops who hadn't been in combat also had a high order of morale, and their physical condition appeared to be excellent, too. They appeared to be well-trained, insofar as men could be well-trained without actually engaging in battle. I saw at no time any evidence of lack of confidence in their own individual ability or in their leaders.
Colonel Montgomery, how much training did these men have that approximated the conditions they are now facing as they land on the European continent?
All the tactical divisions went through the excellent course of training at the United States Army Assault Training Center in England. There they practiced making landings on hostile beaches. The beaches were mined with reduced charges of landmines. They also learned how to move forward to capture objectives several miles from the beach. They worked with full-scale models of concrete seawalls, exact duplicates of the German Atlantic coast defenses which they're up against now.
Colonel Ulmer, it's about time we heard from you. What about the weapons used by our assault forces?
Many types of weapons were probably used. Infantry mortars, chemical mortars, filtratory fire, probably from landing craft, flamethrowers. And in the initial stages, naval gunfire is effective against concrete fortifications.
Colonel Montgomery, do you have anything to add on that score?
Well, concrete emplacements may be attacked in various ways. By rocket fire from launchers mounted on medium tanks, by point-blank artillery fire from 155-millimeter guns and those of higher caliber, and by engineering methods, by pushing explosives up against the wall, by tanks, or placing them there by hand.
And, of course, by bombing operations from the air. Planes can hurt concrete fortifications if they hit them at a crucial point, but I think aviation will be used to harass enemy supply lines and to strafe enemy troops.
Well, what about the possibility of an early German counterattack? Colonel Montgomery?
We can expect local German counterattacks at any time, but a concentrated, coordinated German counterattack will probably not take place until the German High Command feels sure they know where the principal Allied effort is being made.
Colonel Ulmer, how about a word for your special field of interest, the infantry, the humble doughboy?
Thousands of tons of equipment and gear were shipped to England. Hundreds of specialists had to do many small tasks, but their only purpose was and is to get the man with the rifle forward, the infantryman. He's the guy who's going to win this operation. From General Eisenhower on down, the idea is to get the man with the rifle forward. He may travel by air or on a boat, but when he wins this thing, he'll do it on his own 2 feet.
Well, there's more to an infantryman these days than just a man with a rifle. Isn't that right, Colonel Ulmer?
Yes, today's infantryman fights not only with a rifle and bayonet, but with mortars, cannon, carbines, automatic rifles, light and heavy machine guns, and grenades. An infantry regiment has at least 15 different weapons, but all of them are only to get that doughboy with the rifle in his hand forward.
And how about a last word from you, Colonel Montgomery?
I believe, and I know Colonel Ulmer agrees, that the American Army taking part in the invasion today is the best equipped and best trained American Army that has ever entered the initial stages of combat.
Thank you, Colonel Robert Montgomery and Lieutenant Colonel John Ulmer. Now back to Morgan Beatty.
Thank you, Holly Wright, Colonel Montgomery, and Colonel Ulmer. There are 2 points there that I think will bear repeating. The point of the fact that this army that's attacking the coast of Europe today is the most experienced army of its kind in history. That sounds strange, coming as it does from a nation that has not been at war and has not planned for war for many years. But you must remember that this is amphibious attack in a modern way. And we are more experienced in amphibious attack in all parts of the world, the British and ourselves, than any other armed forces. And then that other point about the infantrymen. The other day, Admiral Cochrane came to this studio and with me pointed out the very important thing, that infantrymen must take real estate before anything can happen in the way of victory in warfare. A couple of hours ago, I sat in the Senate with a group of our lawmakers discussing invasion. Some of them went on the air to express their feelings to you and what they were thinking. I've never seen the lawmakers of the nation in quite the mood they expressed today. Senator Alban Barkley sat silent in his chair. The majority leader, the leather-lunged orator, was not in an oratorical mood. But he came to the microphone and said just about what any boy's father would say, and then his mind went back to the hymns of childhood in old Kentucky. Like all of the rest of us, Senator Barkley seemed to sense that this is a supreme moment in history. The men and women who must carry us through now are at their battle stations. They've already begun to take part in the greatest military effort of all time. The combined effort more nations than you can count on your fingers and toes are making. All of us share hopes and fears for these brave men. But there are people in the background, millions of them, who've done more than just hope, more than fear. They represent the spirit of people generally in the Allied world, civilians in the rear rank, you might say. There are people like Mary Galasso, whom I met in England more than a year ago, a second-generation British girl of Italian descent, a girl from Liverpool. And in a short year's time, Mary Galasso won her way from complete obscurity to a place on the envied 1,000 crew of girls who aimed the deep-throated anti-aircraft guns in the darkness at Hitler's blitzing planes over England. Mary was a poor toy factory girl who wanted to do something big for Britain, so she got a job in the ATS, the Women's Auxiliary Army, the British version of the WACS over here, and Mary mastered the radar control system, and when I saw her in Britain, she was the champion calculator of her gun emplacement in the London zone. Mary is 33, unmarried, and she wants to make a career out of Britain's guns, and she's tending one of those guns today on Invasion Day. Another great woman in Britain is Grandma Peg. Mrs. Mary Peg is her real name, who's turning out airplanes or helping to in her 79th year. I get up, she says, at 6 o'clock and come home at 7 in the evening, but it's worth it to smash Hitler. And I almost left out the telephone operator in London who lost both arms in the original Blitz. She's 18, and after she had lost her arms, she had the burning ambition to return to work. So officials of the Ministry of Pensions sent a limb manufacturing mechanic around to her hospital, and he spent months on the job. There's a special gadget now on her right arm, a sort of extension, and a billiard cue rest for the other arm. Mechanical bits and pieces, they say in Britain, enable this girl to dial phones and plug in cords. And she's on the job today for invasion. freeing another worker for more vital war work. Here in America, the pressure for woman power to fill out the gaps, piece out the manpower, is not so great. Even so, Fritz Reiner of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra has taken on 18 women. 2 of these women played the stringed bass, usually reserved for men. Few of us realize how important it is to carry on with the regular affairs of everyday life in wartime, especially in these critical hours, so long as we do not impair the tempo of the battle. These 18 women in Pittsburgh are doing their part. Then there's George Wolkemer, Jr. of Chicago, and his neighborhood gang. They set out a few weeks ago to collect waste paper to help win the war. George's 3 little sisters, between 6 and 10 with the advance agents, they scouted out new sources of supply through the neighborhood. George and his brother, George Cortellette, they're 12 and 13, were the heavy men with the wagon, the Wolkemer's little red wagon. And in 4 days, working after school and evenings, these children collected 4,622 pounds of waste paper. Mrs. Wolkemer was surprised and curious about all this sudden industry. What inspired the campaign, and when would it end, she asked. And sure enough, there was a plan. George and his gang wanted money. Yes, money for model plane kits, George's favorite hobby. But the kits were going to wounded soldiers in a hospital in the nearby neighborhood. And then there's the tragic side of civilian work in war. In Silver Spring, Maryland, near Washington the other day, a funeral procession drove slowly away from the mortuary. It was just like any other funeral, you'd think. They were burying Mrs. Lorraine B. Chandler, a 21-year-old Navy bride of 8 months. Nobody would have known that Mrs. Chandler was a war hero. Nobody fired any salutes. Nobody played taps. But she was a war hero. For Lorraine Chandler died in the Bureau of Standards in Washington. She was blown through a second-story window in an explosion. The details cannot be told until after this war has passed us by. All they'll say over at the Bureau of Standards is that Lorraine was working with 4 other scientists, most of them youngsters like herself, on an urgent war project to make our aviation gasoline better, the very gasoline that is propelling the planes on invasion day. And we're told they did make aviation gasoline better. But Lorraine Chandler might as well have died on the battlefield or in an airplane like the Colin Kellys and all the others who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Because, after all, it takes 120 civilians to make a war, as well as 10 million brave fighting men. And some of these civilians, a few, give their lives too. That's all for now, and thank you. I'll be back tomorrow at this same time.
You've heard Morgan Beatty from the NBC newsroom in Washington and his analysis of the invasion news. We also heard from Colonel Robert Montgomery and Colonel Ulmer speaking from the huge Army Pentagon building across the Potomac River from the nation's capital. Morgan Beatty is heard over most of these same stations every weekday, Monday through Friday, from the NBC newsroom in Washington. Tomorrow, at this same time, keep up with the news with Morgan Beatty. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
This communique said only that landing operations in Europe had begun. We're allowed now to release some more details on the action. In the first phase, before the landing, the weather was unfavorable. There were rain squalls and the channel was rough. But by each hour, the weather had changed for the better. And we're also able now to hand a bouquet to the men of the minesweepers who did a magnificent job in clearing the landing areas of thousands of mines under the noses of the German coastal batteries. The news of the invasion was originally broken by the Germans at 6:30 this morning, midnight Eastern wartime. There was no official word from London until 3 hours later. When the news did get around here, there was no dancing in the streets. Nobody blew his top, nor is anyone likely to until the outcome is finally assured. We now take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness account of the naval action. Stanley Richardson reporting.
Scale military invasion operation in history.
While we are awaiting London to reestablish contact with its remote point this morning, here are several late bulletins which have been received in New York headquarters of CBS World News. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force states that over 640 naval guns from 16-inch to 4-inch are bombarding the beaches and enemy strong points in support of the armies. Here's another report, but this one comes from the Germans. The enemy's Transocean News Agency says that Allied paratroopers now back to London.
Area. No low-flying fighters came over to strafe us with machine gun fire. And no enemy vessels, not even one of their vaunted E-boats, came out to the attack. The officers and men with whom I rode wondered searchingly about this. They had been keyed up for some real German opposition, both from the air and the sea. Their trigger fingers were itching for a scrap, and they were a very disappointed lot at not getting it. If the Germans weren't just too timid to come out, the only other ready explanation that could be advanced was that they were too busily engaged in coping with the Allied air attacks made on their shore establishments as a prelude to the actual landing of troops. In the area we covered, we could see hundreds of bombers and fighters shuttling back and forth, dropping their bomb loads and returning to England for more explosives to blast the enemy. We could see the big two-engined American transport planes, also in the hundreds, returning to their bases in the United Kingdom after dropping their airborne troops in France. Yes, Jerry had a lot to keep him busy last night and early today, but as far as the naval phase of our activity was concerned, not a shot was exchanged with the enemy while I was on the scene. For that preliminary phase of the show, at any rate, it was all too incredibly easy. We left our patrol torpedo boat based in daylight to accompany the slower-moving light advance guard of ships which had to pave the way for the actual landing. One of our missions was to protect the Allied minesweepers, which cleared a wide channel straight to the enemy shore for our troop transports and supply ships. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline, literally miles of craft in even columns converging upon the area in the channel marked for the concentration point for the actual invasion. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies and laboring over heavy seas. You people at home would have been thrilled to the bone to have seen all these American men, American ships, and American supplies sailing calmly into the action for which they had been prepared and trained for so many months. It was estimated that there were more than 4,000 ships of all kinds in the channel for this combined operation. By nightfall, we were nearing the French coast, and our watch tightened. But nothing happened. Even when a full near moon, appearing fitfully from behind the clouds, gave our position away clearly to any enemy who may have been lying in wait for us. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. The warships started laying their smoke screens preparatory to shooting their guns. It was within only a few minutes of H hour of the long-awaited D-Day, and right there was where I got the biggest disappointment of my life. We turned around and headed back at high speed for the English coast. Our P-2 squadron was under orders to return to base and refuel for another mission as soon as its first operation was completed. So I didn't even hear the bombardments begin. But I can tell you that if things are going as well now as they look to be going at the time I left the scene, it won't be long before our troops have a firm foothold. And now here is Merrill Muller at the advanced command post of the Allied forces. Hello, New York. 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 That's it.
While we're waiting for contact with correspondent Merrill Muller at an Allied advanced post, here are two late details which have been received. The German Transocean News Agency says that Allied paratroopers have been landing on the islands of Jersey and Guernsey, west of the Normandy Peninsula. Another German report says that new Allied landings have been made on the Normandy Peninsula this afternoon, British time, with tanks going ashore in one area. Those are German reports, though, and should be taken as such. A dispatch from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force says that Allied troops have secured a beachhead and dug in, according to military circles, in the area. It is not known presently how deep the penetrations are. We are awaiting for further contact with an American radio correspondent in London. So far this morning, we've heard from CBS correspondent Richard C. Hotlett, and then we heard from Stanley Richardson, an eyewitness report of the naval situation. In a moment, we hope to contact correspondent Merrill Muller at Allied Advanced Base. CBS correspondent William J. Dunn has just reported from Australia that first news of the invasion sent Australians and Americans alike to their radios. But so far, he says, there hasn't been any external excitement. The Australian radios, commercial and government-owned, have been giving the right-of-way to invasion news, and they've been broadcasting General Eisenhower's statements at regular intervals. Dunn reported that Acting Prime Minister Francis Ford termed the invasion Dunkirk in reverse and called for nationwide prayers. The Paris radio says that the battle of the Cotentin Peninsula seems to be gaining depth. Well, the Germans came on the air with the first announcement of the invasion, but coming from enemy sources, this word was taken with some skepticism. And those who were still up and listening in at that time of night, it was 12:30 Eastern wartime then, merely heard the announcement and let it go. A half hour later, the Germans said the French coast around Le Havre was being bombarded violently. Almost an hour after that, at 4 minutes until 2 a.m. Eastern wartime, the German-controlled Calais radio came on the air with the statement, "This is D-Day." At 2:30, Allied spokesman from General Eisenhower's headquarters broadcast a warning to the occupied countries of Europe, a warning that a new phase of Allied air offensive had begun, and ordered those peoples of the occupied countries to move 22 miles inland. Well, by this time, there was a growing feeling that certainly something was cooking, although no one here could be sure that it was the invasion. On the assumption that this was the day, CBS remained in operation past its usual closing time. CBS reporter Bob Trout was on the air at that time, giving a general description of the New York headquarters of CBS World News, and there was an increasing tension that big things were about to pop. At 3:29 a.m. Eastern Wartime, Berlin radio said, the first center of gravity is Cannes, the big city at the base of the Normandy Peninsula. And then 3 minutes later, at 3:32, there came the official Allied announcement that Allied armies have started landing on the northern coast of France. 8 more minutes, and it was then announced that British General Sir Bernard Montgomery was in command of the assault army, an army comprised of Americans, British, and Canadians. So this was it. This was the invasion, the D-Day we've all been waiting for. Here's another late report. The British radio has just announced that 2 beachheads have been secured by the Allies in France. No details at the moment. Early reports from correspondents on the scene emphasize the completeness with which we hit the enemy shore, from the land, from the air, and the sea. Columbia's shortwave listening station is already recording a lot of German propaganda about the invasion. It's the same old tune, only louder. Believe it or not, German propagandists are saying we invaded Europe because we couldn't evade Moscow's orders any longer. The old Bolshevik menace again. Radio Berlin has already rung in one of its puppet dictators with a comment. He's strictly a minor dictator. Dictator Pavlicic of Croatia, who carries the charming title of Plavnik. That means the Führer in Croatia. Well, this morning we brought you early morning reports from correspondents in London, both CBS and other radio networks, reporting from London, reporting on the naval situation at sea, and a partial report from an Allied correspondent at an Allied advanced post. This program has come to you as a feature of CBS World News. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. CBS News headquarters in New York. Bob Trout speaking. We're continuing our coverage of the invasion, which started last night in northern France. Now, you just heard Alan Jackson tell you that the BBC has said that Allied troops have set up bridgeheads at least 2 points. This broadcast was recorded by Columbia's shortwave listening station in New York, and we now have an additional detail to add to that report, and it is this. The BBC also reports that the Allied formations are advancing inland. That's the latest scrap of information that we have so far. We'll continue to give you the latest as it comes in. And now here in our news headquarters, once again, is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
Perhaps the most important news that we have received
since the all-important news that invasion had begun. This report from the British radio that 2 beachheads, not bridgeheads, a bridgehead is a river crossing, have been secured by the Allies in France. This is supported by the report just received that the Allies are penetrating inland, and by a report picked up from the Paris radio, which says that the battle in the Cotentin Peninsula, that is the Normandy Peninsula, as it has been called in other broadcasts, where the city of Cherbourg is, seems to be gaining depth. If we have, in fact, established 2 beachheads, as the British radio has announced, and as there is, therefore, every reason to believe, we have made a successful landing. We have carried through the first phase of our operation successfully. We're established on the European shore and are developing from those beachheads our operations inland against the enemy communications. We must expect the enemy to counterattack as soon as he has collected sufficient forces for the purpose. He has to wait until he knows where we're coming before he can do this. It may be some time, it may even be several days before enemy counterattacks develop in great force, so we may expect local counterattacks from local reserves. But the news that 2 beachheads have actually been established suggests that the opposition has not been very strong, as Mr. Hotlett and other observers have suggested previously, and that the enemy is therefore adopting the elastic system of defense, which holds the front line very lightly and holds the bulk of his forces back for counterattack purposes later on after he sees what our plans are. But thus far, with the establishment of these 2 beachheads, our plans are, or appear to be, developing successfully, and there is good reason to feel satisfaction over this news. Now, here again is Bob Trout.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott. If you've been with us for some hours now, you've been able to tell how the news is coming in, the news of the invasion which has at last begun. It comes in very short snatches, and here is the latest brief dispatch from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Great Britain. More than 640 naval guns, ranging from 4 to 16 inches in size, are bombarding the beaches and enemy strongpoints in support of landing forces. Just one-sentence dispatch which comes from Supreme Headquarters, and that is the fashion in which the additional details are coming in. As you know, if you have been with us most of the night, the actual word that the invasion had begun came in communique number 1, a very brief communique of 1 sentence only, which merely said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. And then, since then, we've been getting these brief dispatches. It's almost wrong to call them dispatches. They're just additional details. They're not communiques. There has been only 1 communique, but the details have been coming out in these brief sentences released from time to time by the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, the Supreme Headquarters being somewhere in Great Britain. From time to time also, we've been bringing you reports direct from London. We've heard our own correspondents. We've heard correspondents who have been broadcasting for the combined Allied radio networks as part of the pool. The pool is an arrangement which, as you probably know by now, has been set up in order to cover the early stages of the invasion, and in the pooling arrangement, nobody's copy is exclusive and everybody is able to use everybody else's. Here's a note on General Eisenhower, which came in a few moments ago, and it tells us that General Eisenhower spent last night from early evening until after dusk paying informal visits to United States paratroop units, which were due to make early morning landings in France. This is reported in a cable by correspondent Robert Barr, who accompanied the Supreme Commander during his 11th hour tour. General Eisenhower chatted with the paratroops, who had their faces blackened, and they were loaded with equipment as they marched off to their aircraft. Later, General Eisenhower watched the takeoff of the first C-47s, loaded with the paratroops, as they set off in the fading light Monday night to open the long-awaited second front. Earlier in the day, General Eisenhower paid an informal visit to a British infantry battalion, and he wished the British soldiers good luck as they boarded their landing craft and prepared to set out into the English Channel for D-Day and H-Hour. After the communique came through in the early hours last night, which we broadcast to you. As a matter of fact, it was broadcast direct from London. We got, at that point, a good many other broadcasts direct from London. We're going to have a good many more in the hours to come and also in the days to come. Perhaps I can tell you briefly some of the things that happened during the night. Just a short list, really. General Eisenhower's order of the day to the troops of the soldiers, the men of land, sea, and air forces, was read from London by Columbia's chief European correspondent, Edward R. Murrow. And then we switched back to London again, and General Eisenhower himself came to the microphone to deliver a message to the people of Europe. General Eisenhower's message to the people of Europe was followed by a speech in Norwegian by King Håkon of Norway that was translated into English by an anonymous speaker. Then came the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Dr. Gerbrandy, and he spoke in Dutch. His speech was translated into English. And then came the Prime Minister of Belgium, Monsieur Pirlo, who spoke in French, and his speech was translated into English. We also heard from our CBS correspondent, Richard C. Hotlett, who was in a Marauder plane over the enemy coast during the early hours of the invasion and returned to Britain in time to broadcast to us directly only an hour or so after the first communique came in. And we also heard during the course of the night a two-way radio conversation between Edward R. Murrow in London and Paul White, Columbia's director of news broadcasts, here in New York. And we've heard a great many of these pooled broadcasts from Britain, that is, the broadcasts which are available to the combined Allied radio networks. We've also heard from Washington from time to time, and we shall hear more broadcasts from Washington as the day goes on. We're expecting another broadcast from London very shortly now. Later in the day, I might remind you, we expect to bring you the speech of King George VI, who will speak from Great Britain. We heard that General Charles de Gaulle had arrived in London. General de Gaulle did not speak to the people of France, as the King of Norway spoke to the people of Norway, and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands spoke to the people of Holland, and the Prime Minister of Belgium spoke to the Belgians. However, we may be able to bring you a broadcast, or at least a report of a broadcast by General de Gaulle later in the day, as it seems likely that he will make some sort of broadcast or some sort of speech to the French people. He now is in London. As I was telling you a moment or two ago, we are expecting momentarily now to bring you another one of those broadcasts from London. I should think it would be a pooled broadcast, but we should have the information in just a few moments. And now I understand that it will be a pooled broadcast available to the combined Allied radio networks, a broadcast by Stanley Richardson and Merrill Muller. Go ahead, London.
One second. 5 seconds in.
This is London. We now take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness of the naval action. It is by Stanley Richardson. Hello, New York. We're having a slight technical difficulty. We will try it again. Hello, New York. We're encountering slight technical difficulties. We will hope to go ahead in just a moment or two. We've been listening to the voice of Edward R. Murrow. You've been hearing it, too, as Mr. Murrow attempts to establish contact with two correspondents who are on the coast of England. In a moment or two, Mr. Murrow hopes to establish contact with them, and when he does make the contact from London to the coast, then we shall bring you the broadcast. It's impossible to tell how long it will take to get the coast, and perhaps he may not be able to get the coast at all. As a matter of fact, this particular broadcast we had made an attempt to bring you this particular broadcast at an earlier time, and at that time there was some difficulty encountered. Apparently the difficulty is somewhere on the lines, or somewhere between the coast of England and the Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain. At any rate, Mr. Merrill now informs us that he's unable at this time to establish contact with the two pool correspondents who are on the coast. He'll undoubtedly make another try, and when he does, if he is successful, of course, we will bring you the broadcast. And now here's a late dispatch just come in. In London, we hear life goes on as if the greatest day in all our history has been taken in our stride. The people went to work in a normal way. The road menders got on with the job of repairing the streetcar tracks, tramcar tracks they'd call them. The milkman delivered the milk in his usual British stolid manner, nothing excitable in his good morning, and the housewives, as they formed their queues for fish, talked in normal tones of how they'd been kept awake by the roar of Allied planes, which during the night gave France its biggest and heaviest installment of the Allies' softening up campaign. And now, oh yes, I've just been handed another sentence. You've already heard this one, but it's the very latest news of the battle that we have had, so I'll give it to you again. The British Broadcasting Corporation says that 2 beachheads have been secured by the Allies in France. I've given you that once before, but that's the very latest detail that has come in. It's from the BBC, and it was heard here in New York by Columbia Shortwave Listening Station. During the broadcast, which began many hours ago, shortly after midnight New York time, we switched to Washington several times to bring you various aspects of the reaction in our nation's capital. And now we're going to give you some press comment, which will undoubtedly be interrupted before we get very far with it by a broadcast from London. I shouldn't really call it an interruption because, of course, we're very glad indeed to have our press comment or anything in New York interrupted by a broadcast from London bringing you the latest news. So I just have been told that we'll try London again in about 1 minute from now, so I shan't try to get into the press comment. There'll be plenty of time for that later on. I was going to give you some of the editorial comment from the big New York newspapers, which are now on the streets, but later we shall have that. There'll be time after the broadcast from London. Another late bulletin, the latest one, from London, United Press. More than 1,300 Royal Air Force heavy bombers struck the mightiest blow of the war at the chain of German batteries along the northern coast of France last night and early today, just before the Allied invasion. That's the very latest from London. These details are coming in so quickly, the only thing to do is to listen to them and try to add them all up because each detail may concern something entirely different. This one concerns last night's attack by the Royal Air Force. More than 1,300 heavy bombers struck the mightiest blow of the war at the chain of German batteries. And now, go ahead, London.
This is London. Again, we shall attempt to take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness of the naval action. It is by Stanley Richardson.
CBS News headquarters in New York. We're still trying to get that broadcast from London. That is, we get Edward R. Murrow in London, but Mr. Murrow is still having difficulty making the contact with the correspondent or correspondents who are apparently somewhere on the coast of England. They either have a view of what's going on down there, or perhaps they have returned from covering the naval activity. Perhaps they've actually gone out in one of the ships and are now back to give their story. However, once again, Mr. Murrow informs us that at this time he is not able to make contact. He will be trying again. He's tried several times already this morning to get this broadcast through. He will be trying again, and when he notifies us that he's ready to try it again and thinks that he might get through to the pooled correspondents who are somewhere on the coast, we shall again, at that point, switch you to London, and we'll try to bring the broadcast in again. Now, that press comment that I was talking about a few moments ago, I think we may have an opportunity to get that in and to learn a little bit about the reaction so far at this early hour of the morning here in the United States. And so for the press reaction, here is Alan Jackson.
Here is what the New York Times has to say on D-Day. At last, says the Times, the supreme moment has come. The months and years of waiting are over. The men who left Dunkirk 4 years ago are returning. They are returning as part of a great force commanded by generals of proven worth. They are meeting and will meet terrible obstacles. And the next few hours and days will be critical in our history and in all human history. We must wait in patience for news that may be slow in coming. Today, concludes the Times, we can only pray that the ones we love be spared. But we must pray, too, for the knowledge and skill to create out of this slaughter a just and lasting peace. That was from the New York Times. Here's what the New York Herald Tribune has to say on invasion morning. The moment is too solemn, says the Tribune, for idle excitement. The issues are too great to be quickly or easily decided. The battle now joined may last for days or weeks or months. The tide of battle may shift in one direction or another. The costs may be heavy. One can only await the event in calm and with prayer. However, the immediate fortunes may go on the grim beachhead battle lines. Civilization stands at crisis. That's the editorial comment this morning from the New York Herald Tribune. Around the country, D-Day has arrived on an America that is prepared for heavy fights and tough sacrifices ahead. Michigan's Governor Kelly has issued a proclamation setting 10 a.m. this morning, Eastern Wartime, for a statewide observance of D-Day for that state. Sirens and whistles will sound the hour, and all citizens will pause for a moment of prayer. In Ohio, there are no spontaneous celebrations, but early this morning, and even now, thousands of citizens are going to church to offer up prayers before going to their jobs. Governor Bricker says the invasion marks the beginning of the end of the forces of evil and destruction. Herbert Hoover says the end of German tyranny is on the way. We have faith in our army. We pray for the safety of all our courageous boys. Every city, town, and hamlet in the country will mark the day in some special way. The first announcement of the invasion, early this morning, found most of the streets and gathering centers comparatively deserted. In New York, a city which seldom rolls up its sidewalks, there were no demonstrations. Groups of servicemen and civilians gathered here and there about the town, around taxicabs, and listened to radio reports of the big event. In several sections of the city, apartment lights blinked on one after another as friend told friend and called one another on the phone to break the big news. War workers received the momentous announcement on all-night graveyard shifts. At a Bendix plant in Brooklyn, 500 swing shift workers gave a spontaneous cheer when the news was received. But then the workers remained at their jobs, and not a second was lost. A scene probably typical of that in many public places was enacted at a restaurant on the east side of New York. About 20 diners rose and listened with bowed heads as the first reports of the invasion came in by radio. New York's Mayor LaGuardia has announced plans for a mass prayer meeting at 5:30 this afternoon. The meeting will be held in Madison Square, where the eternal light, a memorial for soldiers of the last war, burns continually. Most of the churches throughout New York, as well as in all other towns and cities, will have special services. And now, back to Bob Trout.
That was Alan Jackson, who was giving us the reaction here in the United States to the news of the invasion. It's rather early in the morning still to get too much reaction. That was a good deal of reaction, but undoubtedly, I just want to take this opportunity to remind you that undoubtedly our audience is growing constantly as people may tune in who have not heard about the invasion before or who have not heard the details. And now, once again, I'm about to be informed that in a few seconds we're going to hear from London. Go ahead, London.
It is by Stanley Richardson.
This is the Advanced Allied Command Post. American war correspondent Stanley Richardson has just returned from the second front beachhead with the first naval eyewitness of the operation. Mr. Richardson.
I've just returned from the Channel approaches to the coast of France, where I was privileged to watch the opening phases of the largest scale military invasion operation in history. My ringside seat was the heaving deck of a United States Naval Patrol torpedo boat, on which I traveled across the Channel with the first contingent of a naval task force. This force was composed mostly of American units. From the time we left the British coast until we were within a short 2 or 3 miles of the French shore, our naval units encountered no enemy opposition whatsoever. That, perhaps, is the outstanding fact that I brought back with me. Altogether, my squadron of PT boats was in the channel for about 20 hours. We covered scores of square miles of rolling, choppy sea. We were patrolling and acting as escort for literally hundreds of slower-moving vessels of all descriptions. Many of them had been at sea longer than we had, but the Germans either were taken completely by surprise or just were afraid to come out and challenge us. Not a recognizable enemy plane appeared overhead. At least no bombs were dropped at or on any of the ships in our area. No low-flying fighters came over to strafe us with machine gun fire. And no enemy vessels, not even one of their vaunted E-boats, came out to the attack. The officers and men with whom I rode wondered searchingly about this. They had been keyed up for some real German opposition, both from the air and the sea. Their trigger fingers were itching for a scrap, and they were a very disappointed lot at not getting it. If the Germans weren't just too timid to come out, the only other ready explanation that could be advanced was that they were too busily engaged in coping with the Allied air attacks made on their shore establishments as a prelude to the actual landing of troops. In the area we covered, we could see hundreds of bombers and fighters shuttling back and forth, dropping their bomb loads and returning to England for more explosives to blast the enemy. And we could see the big two-engined American transport planes, also in the hundreds, returning to their bases in the United Kingdom after dropping their airborne troops in France. Yes, Jerry had a lot to keep him busy last night and early today, but as far as the naval phase of our activity was concerned, not a shot was exchanged with the enemy while I was on the scene. For that preliminary phase of the show, at any rate, it was all too incredibly easy. We left our patrol torpedo boat base in daylight to accompany the slower-moving light advance guard of ships which had to pave the way for the actual landing. One of our missions was to protect the Allied minesweepers, which cleared a wide channel straight to the enemy shore for our troop transports and supply ships. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline. Literally miles of craft in even columns converging upon the area in the channel marked for the concentration point for the actual invasion. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies and laboring over heavy seas. You people at home would have been thrilled to the bone to have seen all these American men, American ships, and American supplies sailing calmly into the action for which they had been prepared and trained for so many months. It was estimated that there were more than 4,000 ships of all kinds in the channel for this combined operation. By nightfall, we were nearing the French coast, and our watch tightened. But nothing happened. Even when a full, near moon, appearing fitfully from behind the clouds, gave our position away clearly to any enemy who may have been lying in wait for us. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. The warships started laying their smoke screen preparatory to shooting their guns. It was within only a few minutes of H-hour of the long-awaited D-Day. And right there was where I got the biggest disappointment of my life. We turned around and headed back at high speed for the English coast. Our PT squadron was under orders to return to base and refuel for another mission as soon as its first operation was completed. So I didn't even hear the bombardment begin. But I can tell you that if things are going as well now as they looked to be going at the time I left the scene, it won't be long before our troops have a firm foothold. And now here is Merrill Muller at the advanced command post of the Allied forces.
This is Merrill Miller reporting from the Advanced Allied Command Post of the Invasion Forces. Operations toward the liberation of Europe commenced just a few hours ago. Thousands of ships, both in the air and on the sea, and armies of men are in motion fighting the greatest military amphibious undertaking in history. The whole thing started moving when one man pressed a theoretical button some hours ago. That man was the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who thinks of himself modestly as a Kansas farmer. Every evening, General Eisenhower gathered his staff around him in this secret headquarters, studied their faces, and asked their opinions. A gale had already roughened the channel, but the staff was confident on the winds, tide, and weather of today suiting an amphibious assault upon Europe. That was it. General Eisenhower wished his commanders luck, and the great undertaking then and there began to unfold. The finest collection of military minds in the United Nations had created a plan they considered complete. Every possible contingency had been thought of. A tremendous mass of the greatest military equipment ever devised had been pooled by the Allied attacking forces. A bombardment, the likes of which the world has never seen, was ready to open. Everything that could humanly be done had been done up to the point when General Ike pushed the button. The campaign thus passed to the direction of God and the hands of the common soldier. Early Monday morning, as the huge invasion force made last-minute preparations, General Eisenhower checked his decision again with his staff. The word was still go. Good weather was the prediction for H-hour D-Day. The dominating air support depends on good weather even more than the Allied navies. While landing craft of all types swung in and out of convoys to check their loadings and replace used fuel, General Eisenhower was busy doing the things he wanted to do, the only things he could do, visit his troops. As H-hour D-Day approaches, there is nothing more tactically useless than a supreme commander, except as an inspiration. General Ike is certainly that. I have never seen him more popular with his troops. I have never seen any commander receive greater acclaim or buoy his men more than does General Eisenhower. One British battalion cheered him as they clanked aboard their fast landing barge. He waved a friendly hello, and that broad grin lit up his face, a face that showed nothing but confidence in his men, a face in which fatigue is miraculously erased whenever it mirrors the Allied esprit de corps and the fighting spirit of the little men with rifle and bayonet. He came back from the port full of a sense of victory. No finer force ever went into battle with a better spirit or with greater courage than this one that General Eisenhower heads. In visiting with Royal and American Navy landing craft and with the Allied troops they will carry, the general had been given a lift. Some of his own nervous tension had been relieved. So he arrived at our hidden camp to meet the 4 correspondents attached to his staff. If I never attend another press conference in my life, I shall certainly remember this one. Perhaps because its outstanding factor was that it was more like a staff conference than a general's talk to newspapermen. Here's the picture. Remember that all around us, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men were readying themselves for the outbreak of the battle that all the world had waited for 4 long, dark years. Men from the far corners of the world ready to erase the stain of Dunkirk, to lift the shrouds of Nazi tyranny, to crush the Axis in the growth of the United Nations. Airplanes growled overhead. Ships were gathering and steaming off into the channel, and final road convoys rumbled into the embarkation areas. We all sprawled around the general's private field office and were given the picture. In a tiny tent, some 15 feet square, we sat and listened to the most amazing delivery of dynamic facts I have ever heard. We overcrowded and spilled half out of the tent onto its backyard concrete terrace. It is a modest office. The inner wall of the tent is half lined from the ground up with slats from packing cases. And some ingenious sergeant has stained those slats into imitation fine paneling. The floor is concrete with a couple of rope rugs. There's one desk, a telephone, 2 chairs, and a moderate wall mat. Otherwise, the tent's show is the tree-shaded terrace and 3 pieces of deck chair furniture. You have to tear your eyes from the general to note these things because he holds your interest completely. When you appreciate his tremendous command of facts and figures, duplicated, I think, only by General Marshall, you understand why he was picked for this assignment. It is not opportune to release the details of our briefing on behalf of the General, except in 3 general ways. 1, he wanted all the credit for this campaign to go to the common soldiers of the Allied armies, and he emphasized the lower ranks and the word Allied. His order of the day takes that vein. 2, he had nothing but praise for the untiring efforts and inexhaustible research of his various staffs and his various commanders for air, sea, armies, and supplies. 3, as to the actual plan itself, perhaps I can best put it this way. I have been in on all of General Eisenhower's amphibious assaults, but none was as involved or as mammoth as this one. Last-minute headaches? Yes, the General had a last-minute headache, and he expressed it beautifully when he suddenly jumped from his chair and said, "Good heavens, there's some sunshine." Otherwise, the invasion of Europe had already been pat for days. We came out of the tent and strolled toward his proudest, newest possession, just the General and myself. He praised his new mobile office, a super deluxe job built into a 10-ton truck and trailer and presented to him by the Lockheed workers here. And then I asked him about his own nerves. He stopped, hatless in the sun. He is supposed to be phlegmatic, but he said quietly, "I'm so gall-darn nervous I boil over." He's not supposed to show it. He didn't either. I caught him only twice, wringing his hands or jiggling his English change. But I like reporting that he is human enough to feel what the lowliest of his troops feel. We went to a parachuter space just before their takeoff for France. For this invasion, the General honors his vast airborne forces that are now employed in battle. We went from airfield to airfield, talking to the airborne troops and to the Air Force crews that flew them to their targets. The General's car would roll up, and always the procedure was the same. The men would snap to attention, sneaking a final chew on their gum as they did so. Their faces were smeared with cocoa and linseed oil. It gave a Halloween twist to their grins. When the General ordered them to stand easy, he would move among them. "Where are you from?" General Ike would ask one boy. "What did you do in civilian life? How old are you? Are you a good shot with that rifle? What do you weigh? Who's the toughest man in the battalion?" And so it went down the line. And invariably, off in another corner of the field, the men would start shouting for Ike. Yes, just Ike. And over he'd go, repeating the questions all over again, verbally sparring with them, giving them the impression that this general was just one of the guys who thought they were the best soldiers in the world. One boy said he was an expert rifleman. "Good," said the General. "That's what will win for you tonight." From one quick-witted youngster, the General was told that the toughest man in the battalion would be selected after they jumped in France. "Good," said the General. "Send him back to me, and I'll have something for him." But the visit was brief. The yell went down the line to load plane 1, and the men started trooping off. General Ike yelled good luck and saluted them time after time. This outfit had been assigned the toughest mission of all. They knew it, and the General knew it. And both are part of a winning team. Soon, hundreds of planes were circling overhead in the gathering gloom, their warm yellow lights making them look like huge, horizontal Christmas trees rushing into the night. They took formation and disappeared toward the channel, extinguishing their lights to make their approach the first wave to strike on the second front. His face raised to their thundering black shapes, General Eisenhower watched the planes disappear toward France. Nothing to do now but sweat it out back at the camp. Try to read a cheap murder mystery or a wild westerner. Refrain from calling any of the commanders for news. Just hang on and wait. A stroll down the path with slippers and robe and another cigarette. A pause to hear the faint passage of a fleet of bombers. A game of checkers or gin rummy with Commander Butcher. Will the night never end? Phlegmatic? But when his men have left him behind, he's with them always, just the same. The battle has been joined until his men appeal to him for his renewed assistance. As the campaign takes more definite shape from its fluid beachhead, the general will take his chance and wait. Once he gets the call, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, will step in beside his allied troops with their needs and as their inspiration.
We return you now to the United States. CBS headquarters in New York once again. We've been listening to a broadcast
from London, another pool broadcast which was put on for the benefit of the combined Allied radio networks. We heard Edward R. Murrow, who was speaking from the Supreme Headquarters and who finally established contact with the two correspondents who are somewhere else in Great Britain. We heard correspondent Stanley Richardson give us the first eyewitness account of the naval action in the invasion which started last night. And then we heard Merrill Muller speaking from advanced Allied headquarters describing General Eisenhower's actions on Invasion Eve. And now here at Columbia's news headquarters, sitting next to me at this desk, is our war correspondent Quentin Reynolds, who is going to speak to us now on how the lessons we learned at Dieppe are helping the invasion forces today. Here's Quentin Reynolds.
Up to now, Allied headquarters has not told us exactly where or in how many places our invasion forces landed during the night. The German radio has told us that the main field of operations is the Baie de la Seine, roughly the area stretching from Le Havre to Cherbourg. However, in his talk to the House of Commons this morning, Prime Minister Churchill, there seems to be no doubt that our forces struck boldly at the very heart of the German defenses, the best defended part of the French coast. If the conventional pattern of military tactics is followed, we will, or already have, land on the flanks of this main operational area. Dieppe is on the southwest flank, only about 50 miles from the southern extreme of our landing area. It is only fitting that we make one of the landings on the beaches in front of Dieppe. Those of us who paid another visit to Dieppe in August 1942 are hoping that our troops will make Dieppe a target. We have a lot of unfinished business there. And our troops will get a lot of help there on the beaches at Dieppe. 2 years ago, we left some 3,500 Canadians at Dieppe. Many were made prisoners. Many more died there on the black shale beaches. They were buried where they fell, many of them. And if the ancient words of the Army song are correct, we know that old soldiers never die. It is not too fantastic to assume that the spirits of those Canadian dead have been waiting patiently for this hour. It has been a long wait for them, but the revenge will be sweet. Now at last, those who died at Dieppe will know that their lives were not wasted. The main object of the Dieppe raid was to test out the German defenses, to find out as much as we could about them. We accomplished that object. Without that dress rehearsal, this big show might have been impossible. We learned many lessons at Dieppe. We depended then entirely upon the element of surprise. We did no preliminary bombing. We used no airborne troops. Reports from France during the night and early morning tell us that there was not only a strong preliminary air bombing of the French coast, but a terrific naval artillery barrage as well. Dieppe taught us that we needed this bombardment before we could land with a maximum of safety. At Dieppe, we used no airborne troops at all, and German reserves hurried up unopposed. Last night, thousands of airborne troops were landed and dropped inland. Dieppe taught us that we needed airborne troops to cut off enemy roads, to demolish enemy blockhouses, to disorganize German reserves. At Dieppe, we landed on what was roughly a 5-mile beach area. The whole Luftwaffe came at us, concentrating its strength in that small area. Dieppe taught us that this was a reckless method of landing, that only by spreading out over a period of miles and striking in several places simultaneously could we split the Luftwaffe up into several smaller units, which could be handled easily by our Air Force fighters. There are those who still say that Dieppe was a failure. If you think of Dieppe in terms of lives that were saved during the past 7 hours, Dieppe was not a failure. It was a glorious success. Every lesson that our military commanders learned at Dieppe was utilized during the long hours of last night. The lives of those men who fell at Dieppe were not wasted. And today the ghosts of those who fell there hover proudly over the French coast, satisfied that finally they have come into their own. They know now, and the world knows, that their sacrifice was not in vain. And being soldiers, they are content. I return you now to Bob Trout.
That was Quentin Reynolds here at Columbia's News headquarters in New York, discussing the landing at Dieppe and telling us how the lessons which were learned at Dieppe are helping the invasion forces who are now on the northern coast of France. The latest dispatch we have from London says this. This afternoon, London time, German coastal artillery in France opened up with salvos across the Channel. That was soon after noon today, and the salvos shook towns in southeast England. I suppose it's no longer a military secret that when those German Channel guns open, usually there's been some sort of convoy or some ships going around in the vicinity which they're trying to get. The British Broadcasting Corporation, as heard here in New York by Columbia's shortwave listening station, a few moments ago has quoted the French radio at Algiers as saying that Allied troops in Italy have taken the important road junction of Tivoli, a town which lies east of Rome, and which makes even more interesting this dispatch we have from Moscow from Ilya Ehrenberg, a very brief dispatch, which is considered to be a new hint that Russian forces are getting ready to move toward Germany. The hint is given by Ilya Ehrenberg, the famous Soviet correspondent in the Russian newspaper Pravda. And this is what he says. There's an old saying that all roads lead to Rome. Today, we'll say, all roads lead to Berlin. The Germans don't know by which route the Allied armies will start moving. There are many routes, but they all lead to Berlin. That's what Ilya Ehrenberg, the famous Russian correspondent, said today in the Moscow newspaper Pravda. Another brief and late dispatch just handed me, just in from London. It says that casualties among Allied airborne troops on France have been light. And this was announced by Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, SHAEF, announced today. There's been only one communique, but a great many details are coming out in very small quantities from the Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain, and undoubtedly those details will continue to flow, and as they do, we will give them to you. Just a moment to pause now to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. In approximately a minute, we're going to pause for a 30-second station break identification, and then at 9 o'clock Eastern Wartime, we shall continue with the news. And, of course, Columbia is going to continue its invasion coverage as long as the news is coming in. There's a great deal of news yet to come, and we'll give it to you as it comes. I wonder if I have time to tell you that Prime Minister Churchill spoke in Commons this morning and gave us the first official word since the communique announcing the landings. He said all is going according to plan, and what a plan, he said. And then Mr. Churchill described the operation as the most complicated and difficult ever undertaken. He warned that in the weeks to come, the battle will grow in scale and intensity. And then he disclosed that we have at least 11,000 first-line planes ready to support our ground advances in France. Then the Prime Minister predicted that in finishing off the enemy, we'll come up with a number of surprises. And now this is Bob Trout at Columbia's News headquarters in New York, telling you that we are pausing 30 seconds for station identification. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.